Are you searching for the best in online black radio? Then go to blacktalkradionetwork.com, helping you filter through the noise. Real talk, black talk.
The internet is full of half-truths and all-out lies. We've all seen them, and many people on social media complaining about it. Here's your chance to show and prove. WorldAfropedia.com is a black-owned and operated encyclopedia. There are several thousand articles, but we need help. We can't uncover all the truth ourselves. So please, join us and become a writer, editor, or blogger for WorldAfropedia.com today. Every little bit counts. We owe it to the future generations to put the truth out there. Visit WorldAfropedia.com, the African-centered encyclopedia, a global database of African knowledge for the purpose of bringing about global African wisdom and understanding. WorldAfropedia.com.
A couple of things about the book. First, the title. Why is it called Blood Brothers?
Several people said they were like brothers, okay? And that's certainly part of it. One person even said they were like blood brothers. But beyond that, we're dealing with blood as a leitmotif throughout this book. I mean, boxing is a sport of blood. Politics at this time was a sport of blood. This is a time of assassination. This is a violent time for America. And we were trying to get that sense of the violence of America, and yet how do you maintain a relationship between two powerful people during that time?
Was this outgoing, talkative person the real Cassius Clay?
That's several questions there. Let me first say, who knows who the real Cassius Clay was? This is a person that he was the most wonderful mimic possible. He could inhabit another person. So one person said of Cassius Clay, in fact I've heard this from several persons, if you said something he liked, the next day he would say it. And the third day he would say it better than you said it, and he would think it was his. Okay? I mean, and he could become whoever he wanted to become. You know, there's a poem that I like, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, and I bet you have a copy of Eliot's J. But in that, there's this one line where the poet is going towards an assignation. He's talking about there will be time to prepare the face, to meet the faces that you meet. Okay, the idea is, who is he? Maybe we're a bunch of different people. I mean, we're one person with friends, we're another person with colleagues, we're another person with, we're a succession. Well, this is the way Cassius was. In the Rome Olympics, for example, he was a representative of America, an offender of America. When a Russian reporter asked him about racism in America, he said, "Oh, don't worry about that. We've got important people taking care of that." Okay, it may be hard for me to get a dinner sometimes in the District of Columbia. He didn't say the District of Columbia, but he could have said the District of Columbia. But it's getting taken care of, and America is still the best country ever, including yours, Russian. Okay, that's one phase. Then he turns professional. There's a moment, aha moment. He had a fight in Las Vegas. And he was interviewed early in the morning by a radio. And also fighting in Las Vegas at that time in a wrestling match was a guy by the name of Gorgeous George. And so they're both there early in the morning, and the interviewer turns to Muhammad first, Cassius Clay at this time, and says, "Cassius, how are you going to do in the fight?" Cassius says, "I'm going to win the fight. I'm very confident. I've trained. I'm in shape. My opponent's good. It's going to be a good fight. I encourage everybody to come out and watch the fight. It's going to be a good fight, but I'm going to win." Then he turns to Gorgeous George, and he says, "George, Gorgeous, whatever you call him, How are you going to do it? I'm going to murder him. I'm going to rip off his arm. I'm going to tear out his... If I lose, I will crawl across the ring on my knees. I will kiss his feet. I will ask for forgiveness. And Cassius went, wow. I'd like to see that fight, okay? So it suddenly was born the Louisville Lip. That's another Cassius Clay. And then we have other... So I forgot the original question.
Context of White Supremacy, Gus T Renegade in for another broadcast, hopefully to share constructive information on the system of white supremacy. Today's date, Friday, August 12th, 2016. So I have been told this is our 5th study session on Randy Roberts, Johnny Smith, Blood Brothers, the fatal friendship between Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X. You heard Johnny Smith at the beginning of the program. That was the interview he did with Book TV earlier this year before the passing of Muhammad Ali. He gives his thoughts on why the book is titled Blood Brothers, and you also hear him further expound on the deceptive nature of the former heavyweight champion Muhammad Ali. With that, we will go ahead and get started. Again, we are at the end of Chapter 8, kind of close to the end of Chapter 8. Blood Brothers, the fatal friendship between Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X, Randy Roberts, Johnny Smith, Context of White Supremacy, audio segment number 1.
Since July, when a reporter from the Chicago Sun-Times caught Cassius Clay leaving Mosque No. 2, writers had been investigating his involvement with the nation, probing for clues about his relationship with Malcolm. When he was not training, he visited the nation's mosques, though he never advertised his presence at Muslim rallies in the same way that he did his attendance at Sonny Liston's title fights. In late September, Clay attended an Oakland conference on The Mind of the Ghetto, organized by Don Warden, chairman of the Afro-American Association, a black nationalist group. Warden invited political figures, celebrities, and athletes, including Clay and Malcolm. Although Malcolm did not attend, John Shabazz, minister of the Los Angeles Mosque, represented the nation. When a reporter questioned Clay about his position on the civil rights movement, he denied interest in joining the struggle. "I don't stand for anything," he said. "I'm not a politician. I don't talk against anything. I'm a peaceful man." After the writer asked him about his affiliation with the nation, he replied, "It's like I said, though. I don't identify myself with anybody except Cassius Clay." Much as he might deny his involvement with the nation, his interviews revealed that he had embraced their philosophy. Cassius puzzled writers with a story about how 2 flocks of birds in Africa fought each other, became temporarily mixed, and then separated. The moral of the story, he explained, was that the law of nature created a world where people should associate with their own kind. Listening to Cassius, reporters detected the nation's influence on his evolving identity. In the past, he had proclaimed that he would save boxing because he was the most talented and entertaining fighter in the world. Yet, as he listened to Muhammad and spent more time with Malcolm, Clay began thinking of himself as divine, graced by the power of Allah. "I am the resurrection, I am the prophet," he declared, sent to save boxing. Hearing Muhammad and Malcolm preach about black superiority and the power of true believers affirmed what Cassius had always thought about himself, that he was the greatest. After the conference ended, Cassius traveled to Philadelphia to attend Muhammad's first public lecture of the year. More than 6,000 people, including black and white guests and reporters, packed the arena at the corner of 45th and Market Streets. Sitting erectly in the 3rd row next to Bundini Brown, Clay listened intently as Muhammad gave a lecture titled Separation or Death. The Supreme Minister excoriated the white man, who was created for the purpose of murdering black people. If blacks fail to separate from whites, he warned, they will die. At several points during Muhammad's harangue, Cassius leapt to his feet, loudly applauding his wisdom, while the Jewish Bundini slumped in his chair with a quizzical look on his face. As an auditory learner, Cassius was mesmerized by what he had heard at Muslim meetings. Since childhood, when his father repeatedly told him tall tales, he had gravitated toward grand stories, legends, and myths. Muhammad's yarns about the big-head scientist C.O.W.S, the mothership, and white devils excited Cassius the same way that his father aroused his imagination. Muhammad's simple lessons, that all white men were evil and all black men were good, echoed his father's rants. Over and over again he heard Muslim ministers repeat Muhammad's messages. The oral culture of the nation emphasized preaching and fishing, memorization and recitation, which suited Cassius's communication style. He did not have to prove that he understood Muhammad's doctrine by reading and writing. He could learn about history, politics, and religion simply by listening and talking, an empowering feeling for a man with dyslexia. Near the end of the rally, an official asked Clay to rise from his seat so that everyone could see that one of the most famous athletes in America was proud to stand with the nation. At that moment, even before he won the heavyweight championship, Clay became a propaganda tool for the sect. He was a visible symbol of the movement at a time when the black masses were growing increasingly disenchanted with the nation's failure to improve the conditions of black citizens. No one heard these criticisms more often than Malcolm. On the streets of Harlem, blacks complained that the nation needed to do more. He needed to do more. The black Muslims talked tough, but when it came time to confront the white man, they were nowhere to be found. Malcolm sensed that the disaffection among blacks threatened the future of the movement. He knew that Muhammad would never change his tactics. What they needed then was an infusion of energy and youth, an icon of strong, defiant black manhood, a voice that could be heard above all the noise. So when Cassius Clay received a standing ovation in Philadelphia, a stirring sound that Malcolm had only heard at Madison Square Garden, he knew that he had found the nation's new symbol, a galvanizing force for the movement. Yet the boxer was not yet prepared for such a role. After the rally ended, reporters rushed toward him, but he was in no mood to answer their questions. "If you want to interview somebody, interview Malcolm X," he quipped. "He's really got something important to say." The newsmen were stunned that, for the first time in memory, Cassius did not want to talk. He departed the arena without saying much, worried that the media's muckraking might derail his shot at the title. Clay did not yet realize that Malcolm had bigger plans for him. Nor could he have foreseen that the rally in Philadelphia would be the last time he would ever see Malcolm and Muhammad together. From his third-row seat, he witnessed Muhammad bestow a great honor upon Malcolm, naming him national minister. But this was just another test, a challenge for Malcolm to prove that he really was his most faithful, hard-working minister. What Cassius saw that day was a mirage, a kingdom in harmony. He heard Muhammad close with an eerily prophetic promise. "Malcolm," he said, "will follow me until he dies." Chapter 9. Back to the Grave. How can you justify being nonviolent in Mississippi and Alabama when your churches are being bombed and your little girls are being murdered? Malcolm X. History, Newsweek declared, would mark it. The summer of 1963 was a time of revolution, the season when 19 million U.S. Negroes demanded payment of the century-old promissory note called the Emancipation Proclamation. The Revolution of 1963 was rooted in the rich soil of the South, where overworked field hands bristled under a sharecropping system that locked them into permanent poverty. The revolution could be seen in the northern slums, where blacks protested dilapidated housing, police brutality, and substandard wages. It could be heard in the mourners' cries at Ronald Stokes's funeral, in the prayers of Martin Luther King, and in the sermons of Malcolm X. From the churches of Birmingham to the streets of Harlem, a revolution of rising expectations swept the country. It was a revolution teetering between frustration and faith, despair and hope, nonviolence and bloodshed. In Detroit, Malcolm talked about the revolution. Reverend Albert Clegg, Jr., a black nationalist Christian minister, had invited him to deliver the keynote address at the Northern Grassroots Leadership Conference in November. Organized by the Group on Advanced Leadership, GOAL, the conference attracted a wide range of radicals, militants, Marxists, and socialists who viewed Malcolm as a leader of black nationalism. On November 10th, Richard Henry, GOAL president, greeted 2,000 blacks, most of whom were not Muslims, into the King Solomon Baptist Church with a grand announcement. "Welcome to the Revolution!" At the conference, organizers proclaimed support for the all-black Freedom Now Party, the principle of armed self-defense, and solidarity with the colored oppressed people of the world. From the pulpit, Malcolm delivered his message to the grassroots, a nationalist manifesto that would endure as a source of inspiration for black power activists over the next decade. He began by reminding the audience that what united them, with each other and with the dark-skinned people in Africa and Asia, was resistance to racial oppression. History, he said, taught that only bloody revolution would end the long suffering of black people. The nonviolent Negro Revolution, led by King and other integrationist liberals, he insisted, was not a revolution at all. A real revolution is bloody. Revolution is hostile. Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way. Marches, boycotts, and sit-ins were not revolutionary tactics. "Who ever heard of a revolution where they lock arms?" he asked, singing "We Shall Overcome." You don't do that in a revolution. You don't do any singing. You're too busy swinging. Malcolm's speech gave voice to the growing anger in black America. It also reflected his evolving global perspective, linking the black freedom struggle in America to the anti-colonialist movement in Africa. Between 1960 and 1963, 24 African nations wrested independence from Western colonists. For Malcolm, these revolutions were successful because black people demanded land of their own and engaged in a bloody battle. But, he complained, Negro civil rights leaders were not demanding land. These Negroes aren't asking for any nation. They're trying to crawl back to the plantation. Listening to him speak that evening, activist Gloria Richardson recognized that Malcolm sounded more like a freedom fighter than a disciple of Elijah Muhammad. He hardly said anything about religion or the Nation of Islam. His speech was not written to build the nation or praise the teachings of Muhammad. Instead, Malcolm's message to the grassroots announced his own vision for a mass movement that unified all black people, regardless of religion. It represented an ideological break from Muhammad, a fusion of black nationalism and internationalism, and the declaration of his political independence. That night in Detroit, Richardson wondered how long it would be before he would break with the nation. If Malcolm's loyalty to Elijah Muhammad was in doubt, Cassius Clay's was not. 5 days after Malcolm spoke in Detroit, Clay was spotted in New York with 3 burly black Muslim security guards. A few days before he was scheduled to film an appearance for the Jack Paar Tonight Show, the Selective Service notified him that he was required to get a physical examination, which would determine his eligibility for the armed services. But Clay wasn't worried about wearing a uniform or carrying a rifle. "I've just spent 4 hours with God today," he said, after leaving Mosque No. 7. "He's going to fix it so I won't have to serve in the Army." Clay found his sanctuary visiting with Malcolm in Harlem at Mosque No. 7, the Shabazz restaurant, and the Hotel Teresa, where he was staying. Since Clay returned from London that summer, his relationship with Malcolm had deepened. Spending more time in New York, he snuck into meetings with Malcolm. He solicited his mentor's advice about all things, spiritual and professional. Malcolm, he said later, was very intelligent, with a good sense of humor, a wise man. When he talked, he held me spellbound for hours. In their private moments together, they forged a friendship, a bond, a brotherhood. Clay adored Malcolm and treated him like an older brother. He swelled with pride whenever the minister was near. Malcolm treated him like a man whose thoughts mattered, not like an athlete whose only worth was his body. Cassius, he observed, was sensitive, very humble, yet shrewd. Studying him, Malcolm recognized that the thoughtful boxer had a plan in his public clowning. That plan was on full display when Clay filmed an appearance for the Jack Parr Tonight Show. Before introducing him, Parr mentioned that Clay put on quite a wild act, but he found him to be a genuinely well-mannered young man. Parr told the audience that off-stage, Clay spoke very quiet and sensibly. The fighter's clowning, he suggested, was only an act. Parr's program was known for pairing disparate characters in humorous settings. When Cassius walked on stage, he met Liberace, the flamboyant musician known for his glittering costumes and outrageous personality. When Cassius shook Liberace's hand, he buckled his knees, feigning injury at the strength of the effeminate musician's strong grip, provoking laughter from the audience. Clay reminded Parr that not only was he the resurrection of the fight game, but someday he would also become a great singer, too. After he told the host about his upcoming album with Columbia Records, Parr suggested that he and Liberace perform a song together. It seemed like an odd pairing, a black boxer and a closeted gay pianist, but the two were perfectly suited to share the stage. Both men thought of themselves as entertainers, and they shared a love for audiences. Liberace sat down at the grand piano, then he abruptly rose from the bench and told Cassius to step aside so that the television viewers could see his candelabra. The crowd roared with laughter as Cassius and Liberace exchanged smiles. Finally, the musician deadpanned to the self-promoting boxer, "For a change, do the one about you." After performing a tune, they delivered an encore. Clay comes out to meet Liston, and Liston starts to retreat. If Liston goes back an inch farther, he'll end up in a ringside seat. Clay swings with his left, Clay swings with his right. Look at young Cassius carry the fight. Liston keeps backing, but there's not enough room. It's a matter of time till Clay lowers the boom. Now Clay lands with a right. What a beautiful swing! And the punch raises the bear clean out of the ring. Liston is still rising, and the ref wears a frown, for he can't start counting till Sonny comes down. Now Liston is disappearing from view. The crowd is going frantic, but radar stations have picked him up somewhere over the Atlantic. Who would have thought, when they came to the fight, that they'd witness the launching of a human satellite? Yes, the crowd did not dream, when they put up the money, that they would see a total eclipse of the sunny. Clay's performance won over an audience outside the world of boxing. While reporters hounded him about his association with the black Muslims, Clay distanced himself publicly from the controversial sect. Instead of talking about his relationship with Malcolm or Elijah, he continued to craft a non-threatening image, an image of a smiling, jovial Negro, an entertainer cracking harmless jokes and reciting poems, an act encouraged by his white managers. But the real Cassius Clay, the man who would become Muhammad Ali, could hardly hide his enthusiasm for the most controversial black organization in the country. Dan Parker, a prominent columnist for the New York Journal-American, reported that while Clay was in New York, he visited corporate offices on Madison Avenue, proudly wearing an NOI signet ring, a clear badge of membership, and showed people a picture of himself with Elijah Muhammad. Although Clay maintained that he had not joined the nation, Parker and other sports writers no longer doubted the boxer's membership. Since July, when a reporter from the Chicago Sun-Times caught him leaving the Muslim school, Clay's association with the nation had provoked suspicion that he had been brainwashed by the black Muslims. The Louisville sponsoring group shared the reporter's concerns and worked to disentangle Cassius from Malcolm. Job 1, they thought, was to get their fighter out of New York City and away from Mosque No. 7. Since Cassius had returned from London, he had been markedly distant from his wealthy white benefactors, reluctant to return to training under Dundee in Miami. Bill Faversham talked to Clay's mother, Odessa, explaining the need to persuade Cassius to return to Miami. Promoter Bill King pitched in as well, explaining to Cassius that if he didn't train in Miami, there would be no Liston fight. He reluctantly returned south, but he still chafed under the LSG's guidance. W.S. Cutchins, a prominent member of the group and president of Brown and Williamson Tobacco, reported that Cassius wanted larger paydays. $200,000 after taxes was the number that he fixed on, and no more television appearances, which he had come to consider undignified. Fighting, not acting, was his profession, he asserted, and even if the LSG upped his take for TV appearances to 60%, he was still not interested. Suddenly, it seemed, Cassius no longer wanted to jive on stage or sing songs with Liberace. He didn't want to play the clown anymore. The LSG suspected that the Muslims, one in particular, had persuaded the young fighter to ignore the counsel of his white advisers. The group feared that they no longer spoke for Cassius because Malcolm X did. Malcolm didn't want Clay singing and dancing on television like Stepin Fetchit. If Cassius was ever going to become a freedom fighter like Malcolm, he had to keep his gloves on, outside the ring as well. Cutchinson's solution to separating Clay from the Muslims was to schedule non-title matches for him every few months. Then, between training in Miami and boxing in various cities, he would not have time for Malcolm. Only if they followed that plan could they get just about 75% back to our normal relationship with him. Yet Cassius kept slipping away from Miami to New York. There he met with an associate of Malcolm's, who would become his new business manager. Archie Robinson, a slight, bespectacled, soft-spoken man, not much older than Clay, had first met the young boxer a few months earlier when Malcolm introduced them at the Muslims' luncheonette. Malcolm worried that Cassius needed protection from manipulative white men who exploited black boxers, and knew that he could trust Archie to keep an eye on him. But Archie wasn't interested in wasting his time on the boisterous boxer. A former road manager for the Platters, Robinson did not know anything about the fight game or Clay, except that he found him a bit obnoxious. "He's a clown," he said. "I don't play with amateurs." Malcolm's tone turned serious. He was not asking for a favor. He was giving him an assignment. "It's not about boxing," he said. "One day this kid is going to be heavyweight champion of the world, and he's going to embrace the Nation of Islam. Do you understand what that could mean?" Robinson did. He recognized that the minister believed that Clay could become a unifying force for the nation. He also understood that Malcolm could not always be close to Clay. He had too many responsibilities and too many appointments. That's why he needed Robinson. When reporters noticed the new advisor escorting Cassius around town, he revealed little about their relationship and never mentioned Malcolm's name. "We were brought together by certain persons who knew us in New York," he cryptically told a writer. The more time Cassius spent with Robinson and Malcolm, the more he questioned his contract with the Louisville sponsoring group. In New York, Clay boasted that he was going to free himself from the domination of his 12 white managers from Louisville. As he had said in London, "I am my own master." But as long as white men controlled his career and his finances, Malcolm taught him, he would never be truly free. At some point, he would have to break the white man's shackles. His association with the nation threatened the conservative sports establishment. Dan Parker maintained that the black Muslims were just using Clay as a propaganda tool, and that the boxer did not realize how they might damage his career. But Clay was not the dim-witted fool that Parker made him out to be. He fully understood the risks of associating with the nation. Ever since he met Sam Saxon in Miami, he'd made sure not to talk about his relationship with the Muslims. If Clay had wanted to promote Elijah Muhammad's message, he could have done so, but he didn't. He knew exactly what he was doing. Reporters and the members of the LSG were not the only ones interested in Clay's involvement with the Muslims. A day after Parker published his column, the FBI Chicago field office filed a memorandum justifying the continued surveillance on Elijah Muhammad's mansion. The special agent in charge reported that the surveillance had proven extremely valuable in covering the overall activities of the NOI. The Bureau had learned about the sect's vulnerabilities and discovered that Cassius Clay, the well-known heavyweight title contender, had made arrangements to meet Elijah Muhammad and to also have his parents meet the messenger. Clearly, Malcolm was not the only power broker inside the nation courting Clay. After seeing the way that his followers responded to Clay at the Philadelphia rally, Muhammad grasped the boxer's propaganda value. Given his interest in recruiting more converts and selling more copies of Muhammad Speaks, Elijah relaxed his strict prohibition against Muslim participation in sports, as long as it remained in its proper perspective and did not interfere with the attainment of good education and the building of a strong nation. He also authorized his son Herbert to publish more articles on black athletic achievements in the pages of Muhammad Speaks. Wider sports coverage, Elijah reasoned, would generate more newspaper sales and help him disseminate his message. Previous accounts of this dramatic moment have insisted that Elijah Muhammad had no interest in Clay before he won the heavyweight title. But that story simply isn't true. In fact, Muhammad had set his sights on bringing him closer to the center of the nation well before he fought Sonny Liston. Of course, he also knew that Clay's value rose in proportion to his feats in the ring. If Cassius defeated Liston, it would prove the power of the righteous and affirm the messenger's divine authority to bless those who followed him. Malcolm was sitting at the back table in the C.O.W.S restaurant, counseling his lieutenants, when the phone rang. A shout went out to Captain Joseph. It was his wife on the other line. He walked over to the phone booth and picked up the receiver. Her voice was frantic. After Joseph hung up the phone, he walked back toward Malcolm's table, looking visibly shaken. Then he announced to everyone in the luncheonette, President Kennedy had been shot. Malcolm asked one of the brothers to retrieve a radio from the back of the restaurant. When they dialed in to a news station, the announcer said, "To repeat, we're confirming that the president has been shot in Dallas, Texas, and at this point, we don't know how serious it is." Outside the Harlem restaurant, blacks huddled in front of appliance store windows and crowded inside bars, watching live news broadcasts on television. By mid-afternoon on November 22nd, the whole nation had come to a halt. Americans hovered near their radios or televisions, while reporters and producers scrambled for news from Dallas. Shortly after 2 p.m., ABC radio announcer Don Gardner issued a special bulletin. "The president is dead. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a trying moment for all of us. Let us all pause, and let us all pray." When Malcolm heard the announcement, he remarked coldly, "That devil is dead." Muhammad released a short statement expressing shock over the loss of our president, a surprising comment given his past diatribes against the government. Privately, he worried that the nation would be implicated in some way over the assassination. He ordered all ministers to remain silent about the president. And on Sunday, December 1st, before Malcolm's speaking engagement at the Manhattan Center, he called to again remind him not to talk about Kennedy. After Malcolm's talk, reporters asked him about the president's assassination. At first, he refused to answer the writer's questions, suggesting that the media wanted to trap him into exclaiming, "Hooray, hooray, I'm glad he got it." But when the crowd laughed and clapped, it stirred something in him. He relished delivering a memorable line, and with a little more prodding from the press, he finally gave in. The president's murder, he said, was a case of the chickens coming home to roost. Then, he added, "Being an old farm boy myself, chickens coming home to roost never did make me sad. They've always made me glad." Malcolm believed that Kennedy and the CIA were behind the murders of South Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem and Congolese Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba. He also thought that Kennedy had sat passively while whites murdered blacks in the American South. The president's assassination was an inevitable result of America's culture of violence. Incensed at Malcolm's comments, the nation's National Secretary John Ali immediately telephoned Elijah. Malcolm had disobeyed Muhammad's order, threatening the nation's reputation. Ali also advised Elijah that Malcolm's comments would provoke closer scrutiny from the FBI. Malcolm had made a fatal error. He had handed Ali, Sharif, and Elijah's sons the wedge they needed to separate him from Muhammad, once and for all. The next day, Malcolm and Ali flew to Chicago for a meeting at Muhammad's home. The morning edition of the New York Times quoted Malcolm, exacerbating Muhammad's disappointment in him. After Muhammad and Malcolm embraced, they sat in the living room. Malcolm knew Muhammad so well that he could usually predict what he would say. But this time, he had no idea what was coming. "Did you see the papers this morning?" Muhammad asked. "Yes, sir, I did," Malcolm answered. "That was a very bad statement. The country loved this man. The whole country is in mourning. That was very ill-timed." Malcolm agreed, adding that he understood he had made a mistake. Muhammad stressed that Malcolm's imprudent statement had consequences. "I'll have to punish you for the next 90 days, so that Muslims everywhere can be disassociated from the blunder." He was silencing Malcolm, muting a man whose voice defined him. Malcolm would rather lose a leg or an arm than his voice. But Malcolm had no choice. He accepted his punishment without protest. He would continue his administrative responsibilities at Mosque No. 7, but he would refrain from preaching or speaking to the media. Muhammad instructed Ali to release a public statement to the press. Denouncing Malcolm's comments about Kennedy, Ali informed the media that Malcolm was suspended from public speaking for an undetermined amount of time. In the following days, writers speculated that Muhammad would permanently replace Malcolm as minister of Mosque No. 7. Journalists reported that the nation would split into two factions, one in Chicago, following Muhammad, and another in New York, supporting Malcolm. A writer called Muhammad to ask when he would lift Malcolm's public speaking ban, but he refused to offer a deadline. "We are still brothers, and I still think Malcolm is a wonderful worker of mine," he answered. "But we have rules. We must obey them." Muhammad was not so generous toward Malcolm when he spoke to his closest advisers. He told one aide that Malcolm should have known better than to talk about the president. But Malcolm gave Elijah no choice after he made him look like a fool. Papa, he said, had to spank his son. If Malcolm disobeyed him again, then he would receive a worse beating the next time. Malcolm believed that if he was contrite, his suspension would not last the full 3 months. Muhammad had gone so far as to admit that he would have said the same thing about Kennedy. Nonetheless, Malcolm had disobeyed him, and now Elijah would reassert his authority. When journalist Louis Lomax asked Malcolm about reports implicating his break from Muhammad, he snapped, "It's a lie. Any article that says there is a minor difference between Mr. Muhammad and me is a lie. How could there be any difference between the messenger and me? I am his slave, his servant, his son. He is the leader, the only spokesman for the black Muslims." Yet, while Malcolm maintained public confidence in his return to the nation, he noticed ominous signs. Elijah informed his aides that Malcolm would be reinstated, but only if he submitted, giving his disciples the impression that Malcolm had not capitulated. Over the course of December, Elijah's suspicions of Malcolm deepened. His sons, Sharif and Ali, encouraged him to remind Malcolm, once and for all, who was the supreme minister. Sharif and Ali instructed Captain Joseph and the assistant ministers in Harlem to openly condemn Malcolm for spreading stories about Muhammad. They also reminded Elijah that Malcolm knew things about the royal family that could damage the movement. If he revealed the nation's secrets, the financial abuses, the promiscuous behavior, and the corporal punishment, the entire kingdom might collapse. On New Year's Eve, Muhammad called Captain Joseph and the most prominent ministers on the East Coast. He learned that Malcolm had informed them about Elijah's affairs, including Boston minister Louis X, in spite of Muhammad's specific instructions not to tell Louis about their private conversations. When Malcolm had broached the subject with Louis, he had failed Elijah's test of leadership. Elijah sensed that Malcolm's ambition could not be contained. Malcolm was beyond his reach. Malcolm knew it, Elijah knew it, and soon the world would know it. Muhammad sent word to his most trusted followers on the East Coast to cut ties with the wayward minister. Anyone who took Malcolm's side was his enemy, I'm going to strip him of everything, he told Louis X. Everything. His mosque, his following, his life. Elijah had given Malcolm a new life, and now he intended to take it all back. When Malcolm languished in prison, he gave him hope. When he joined the nation, Elijah gave him power, promoting him to minister. When he showed him loyalty, Elijah gave him love, the love of a father. But now, it was all over. On January 2nd, 1964, during a tense phone conversation, Elijah scolded Malcolm. "I've been hearing about Malcolm this and Malcolm that, and even Malcolm being called a leader," Muhammad fumed. "You made an error," he said harshly, referring to Malcolm's conversations with the East Coast ministers. "I asked your permission in a letter before I said anything, and I understood that it was all right," Malcolm said nervously. "I certainly didn't say such a thing," Elijah raged. Malcolm couldn't believe that the frail, gentle man who had embraced him with such warmth had turned so cold. Elijah showed him no forgiveness. "How can you take this poison and pour it all over my people? I knew all along that you had some sly scheme or shrewd plan to undermine me, but it won't work, sir. Not this time." "Messenger," Malcolm said, "I'd rather be dead than say anything against you." "Then how could Ministers Isaiah and Lonnie and Captain Joseph all have gotten the wrong impression from what you said?" Elijah shouted. "They all wrote to me and said about the same thing." He paused, breathing heavily into the phone. "Why are you checking into my personal affairs?" Malcolm answered that he'd only begun investigating the adultery charges after Muhammad's son Wallace brought it to his attention. And then, after FBI agents in Boston questioned one of Elijah's former secretaries, he'd become more concerned. When agents asked the young woman if her newborn baby was Elijah's, Malcolm had suggested to Louis that it would be a good idea if we told some of our top people about all these rumors so that if they heard about the charges from somewhere else, they would be prepared to deflect them with parables acceptable under Islamic law. He also admitted that he had mentioned this strategy to Captain Joseph and that he'd intended to write you for instructions on how to deal with the matter. "I don't need you to protect me," Elijah said. "I don't need you meddling in family affairs. I know Wallace is the one spreading these lies. I've warned him about going to you with our troubles. You're an outsider." Malcolm was shattered. He'd never imagined that Elijah, the man who had called him son, would ever consider him an outsider. Never before had he heard Elijah shout with such vitriol. Then Elijah cut him again. "I'm suspending you for an indefinite time," he said coldly. "I'm going to be watching you to see if you become stronger, strong enough to resist this poison Wallace is pouring over my people." And with that final message, Elijah slammed down the phone, leaving Malcolm wondering when he would hear from him again. The following day, Elijah called his trusted confidant, Captain Joseph, informing him that James 3X, the head of Newark's mosque, would assume all ministerial duties in Harlem, but Joseph would retain all authority there. Undoubtedly, Joseph's loyalty belonged to Muhammad. Years earlier, he'd been one of Malcolm's most dependable lieutenants, yet their relationship had fractured in 1956, when the captain was accused of assaulting his wife. Before the entire mosque, he'd faced a trial, with Malcolm serving as judge and jury. Joseph pleaded guilty, and the minister banned him from the temple for 90 days. Humiliated, Joseph never recovered from the ordeal. Although he eventually returned as captain, his relationship with Malcolm remained strained and tense. Since 1961, when Muhammad made all mosque captains accountable directly to Chicago, Joseph had become an independent potentate, untethered to Malcolm's authority and nearly equal in power to him. Malcolm strongly disapproved of the way that Joseph disciplined the congregation, and in November 1963 had quietly petitioned Chicago to replace him as captain, a request that was denied. With Joseph assuming complete control over the Harlem Mosque, the New York Muslims were directed to sever all ties with Malcolm. Muhammad informed the East Coast officials that the censured minister was suspended indefinitely, and through his aides told his son Wallace that Malcolm had blamed him as the primary provocateur. Then he summoned Malcolm to Phoenix for a decisive trial, declaring, "I'm not through with Malcolm yet." In Phoenix, Malcolm faced the court, Muhammad, Sharif, and Ali. Since they had last spoke on the phone, Elijah had become even more caustic toward him. Sitting across from Malcolm, he looked at him like a stranger. Malcolm sat uncomfortably until he finally confessed that he had told Captain Joseph and various ministers about Muhammad's dalliances. Elijah demanded that he retract everything he said to them. "Go back and put out the fire you started," he said. After Malcolm returned home, he learned that the nation's headquarters had made it known that no one in the sect could speak to him. Elijah had effectively quarantined him from his people, from his center of power. In Harlem, he learned that a mosque official told members of his congregation, "If you knew what the minister did, you'd go out and kill him yourself." When Malcolm heard that the brothers in his own mosque had started talking about his death, he knew it could have been approved of, if not actually initiated, by only one man. In isolation, Malcolm considered a new reality, a life without Elijah, one divorced from the nation. He had built his entire world around the teachings of Muhammad, committing himself to his mission. Without the messenger he'd preached, he was nothing. Elijah was the one who woke him from the dead. But now he had been cast outside the nation, and he feared that his worst nightmare was coming true. Elijah intended to bury him and send him back to the grave. Malcolm endured his exile in a daze. He tried ignoring the death talk, but he couldn't. His head pounded relentlessly, day after day. It hurt all the time, as if he suffered from dementia pugilistica. "I felt like my brain was damaged," he told Alex Haley. His doctor examined him and recommended rest, but he didn't know how to slow down. His life had become a blur. Everything was out of focus. On January 14th, he met Haley on the 4th floor of the International Hotel at the JFK Airport. For 7 hours, from 7 p.m. to 2 a.m., Haley sat at his typewriter, listening to Malcolm as he paced around the room, sitting only to scribble notes to himself on napkins. Malcolm could hardly concentrate. He knew what happened to insubordinate Muslims. He had seen gruesome images of black men bludgeoned at the hands of Muhammad's avengers. No one survived Muhammad's wrath. He could well imagine stalkers from the fruit attacking him at any moment. Even when he was inside the hotel room, he did not feel safe. He suspected that the FBI had bugged the room, a fear exacerbated by a radio broadcast he had heard just before the meeting, claiming, falsely as it turned out, that the FBI and Rochester police considered him a suspect in an assassination plot against President Lyndon Johnson. He continued to agonize about what would happen if Elijah never reinstated him. Without his position, he would lose his monthly salary and his family's home in East Elmhurst, Queens. He had no savings, no insurance, and no property. He had even signed a contract donating his future book royalties to the NOI. This was no time to write a book. Haley wanted Malcolm to focus on the stories from his past, but all he could think about was his future. What had first been only a vague idea began to take shape. He had long considered how he could benefit from the unique talents and fame of Cassius Clay, but mostly his musings had come from within the structure of the nation. Now, if Elijah forced him out of the NOI, banished him from the organization that had given him sustenance and made him move forward alone, Malcolm needed to consider how he could take Clay with him. How could he pry the boxer away from an organization and a theology that Malcolm had taught him was the foundation of all truth and reality? How could he convince Clay that everything Elijah preached was wrong? Malcolm decided what Clay needed was a dose of political reality. He wanted Cassius to see the dark side of the movement and its leader. Malcolm fully understood that Elijah had ordered him not to talk with reporters and had commanded other members of the nation not to associate with the defrocked minister, a directive that certainly applied to Cassius Clay. Yet, instead of moving a step behind Elijah, reacting to the Supreme Minister's edicts, Malcolm chose to take the lead and compel him to follow. If Malcolm went to Miami and flaunted his friendship with the boxer, He would challenge Elijah to either pull Malcolm back into the fold or punish Cassius. Either way, Malcolm thought, it would strengthen his relationship with Clay. Chapter 10. Trouble in Miami. Where do you think I would be next week if I didn't know how to shout and holler and make the public sit up and take notice? I would be poor, for one thing, and I would probably be down in Louisville, Kentucky, my hometown, washing windows or running an elevator and saying yes, sir, and no, sir, and knowing my place. Cassius Clay. Sports writer Robert Lipsyte, sent to Miami to record the all but certain destruction of Cassius Clay, wrote Sonny Liston's comment into his notebook in red ink. He's a fag. I'm a man. Liston was not the first member of the boxing fraternity to question Clay's manhood. Since 1960, when he began training in Miami, rumors had persisted that he was gay, mostly because he defied simple stereotypes of boxers. From his first professional contest until the Liston match, he showed only a passing interest in women. To be sure, he talked about foxes, spent hours observing them, and engaged in good-natured, non-threatening flirting, but that was about as far as he went. At this stage in his career, Cassius was old school, believing that any sort of sex drained strength and weakened fighters. Masturbation is the curse of mankind, the Ring editor Nat Gleischer wrote in his influential book, Training for Boxers. By extension, sex while training was tantamount to career suicide. Determined to win the title and all the fame and money that went with it, Clay accepted the common beliefs and, for the most part, pushed women to the far corners of his life. His androgynous behavior added to the rumors. Like Emil Griffith, who designed women's hats and spoke in a wispy, breathless voice, Clay's actions defied the conventional masculinity. He seemed obsessed with how he looked inside the ring. His polished white shoes and white satin trunks, Vaseline-coated body, and sleek defensive style seemed dictated more by his sense of aesthetics than any athletic imperative. And no boxer in a sport that almost guaranteed facial cuts and a flattened nose talked more compulsively about his appearance. Choosing feminine adjectives, he repeatedly asked before and after every match, "Ain't I pretty?" or "Ain't I beautiful?" Seldom, if ever, did he refer to himself as handsome. Liston might have sensed that, like Benny the Kid Paret did with Griffith, he could belittle Clay's masculinity by calling him a fag or bitch. But although Griffith was sensitive about his sexual identity, Clay was not. Paret's taunts were on target, causing Emil to respond violently. But Liston's vulgar labels never reached Cassius's heterosexual core. Clay's psychological warfare against Liston was dramatically more effective. He began his campaign in earnest on November 5, 1963, at about 3 a.m. outside Liston's home in Denver. Fleeing police harassment in Philadelphia and looking for a new start and a quiet life, Sonny had moved to Denver and bought a home in an upscale neighborhood filled with well-established bankers, lawyers, physicians, and businessmen. Sports Illustrated's Houston Horn claimed that the week after Liston moved in, 32 for sale signs sprouted in neighborhood lawns. But Sonny wanted peace, not war, with the other homeowners. Liston may have desired a quiet suburban existence, but Clay had other ideas. While Sonny slumbered peacefully, Cassius, aboard a red and white 30-passenger 1953 flexible bus, was headed in the champion's direction. There was nothing incognito about his approach. The slogans Cassius Clay Enterprises, World's Most Colorful Fighter, and Sonny Liston Will Go in 8 decorated the side of the bus, which bounced and rumbled with a circus-coming-to-town festivity. Inside, Cassius, Rudy, Bundini Brown, photographer and friend Howard Bingham, and a few other merry pranksters joked as they planned their assault on Liston's domicile. To guarantee an audience for his performance, Clay had already alerted local reporters that something was about to happen at Sonny's place. Outside the house, Clay hit the horn. Oink, 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 oink. Lights blinked on in the surrounding houses. You know how them white people felt about that black man just moved in there anyway, and we sure wasn't helping it none, Cassius later remembered. People was hollerin' things, and we got out with the headlights blazing. Bingham had a mild stuttering problem, so of course Cassius insisted that he knock on the door and talk to Liston. About the time he reached the door, Sonny, wearing short nylon pajamas, cracked it open. "What do you want, you black motherfucker?" he greeted Bingham. And if his point was not made quite strongly enough, he fixed him with his infamous stare, as if the intruder were a bug about to be pinned in his insect collection. While Bingham beat a hasty retreat, Cassius advanced into the yard, screaming and hollering about how he was going to whoop Liston bad, as Bingham later recalled. "Come on out of there. I'm going to whip you right now. Come on out of there and protect your home. If you don't come out of that door, I'm going to break it down," Cassius raged. Sonny, however, stayed put. Finally, 7 squad cars arrived, and the police sent Clay and his band on their way. Liston was trapped by his past and his police record, and Clay knew it. If the police were called out and he was involved in a scuffle, even one he did not provoke, he knew he would get arrested. Furthermore, Cassius's actions confused Sonny. "You know, if a man figures you're crazy, he'll think twice before he acts, because he figures you're liable to do anything," Clay said. He had planted the seed in Liston's mind. Initially, Sonny assumed Cassius's stunts were just that, harmless acts to build the gate. But as one stunt led to the next, he found it difficult to separate the act from reality. "A man with Liston's kind of mind is very funny. He ain't what you would call a fast thinker," said Cassius. "He's got one of them bulldog kind of minds. Once he ever starts to thinking something, he won't let hold of it quick." Once he had believed that, like virtually every other man, Clay was afraid of him. Now, he did not know what to think. Clay continued his campaign on the afternoon of November 5th when he met with Liston in a Denver hotel to sign contracts for a title match. "I don't want to sit by him," he said when he arrived, and throughout the proceeding he shouted insults at the champion. Liston swatted away the verbal attacks, occasionally laughing at Cassius's performance. "I'm the champ of fighting," he told Clay, "but you the champ of talking." There were reasons for his good cheer. His 40% of ticket, concession, closed-circuit, television, and radio revenue would amount to several $1,000,000. Toward the end of the meeting, as Liston was speaking and Clay was digging into a plate of chicken, the champ looked over at his next opponent and said, "You eat like you headed to the electric chair." Liston and Clay had signed on to fight, but the contest still needed a home and a date. For a while, it seemed that the world of boxing was divided between promoters who did not want any part of Liston and his underworld ties, and promoters who worried that Clay would fare no better than Patterson did against the powerful champion. They feared involvement in a congressional inquiry, a shameful mismatch, and a financial fiasco. Liston understood what constituted an attractive contest. A boxing match is like a cowboy movie. There's got to be good guys and there's got to be bad guys. That's what the people pay for, to see the bad guy get beat. He understood his role. I'm the bad guy. Yet between Sonny's nefarious past and questionable present, and Cassius's incessant patter and black Muslim connections, there was no cowboy to wear the white hat. The December issue of Esquire attempted to put the white hat on Liston. Actually, photographer Carl Fisher shot him in a red with white trim Santa Claus hat. The cover close-up of Sonny's face, his expressionless mouth, flattened fighter's nose, and eyes that projected all the pain of his unhappy life, suggested that there would be no Christmas in 1963, an appropriate metaphor for a nation still mourning the death of President John Kennedy. In Miami, however, there was another Santa. William B. McDonald needs only a snowy beard to pass for Santa Claus, wrote Miami Herald reporter Edwin Pope. Shortly after Esquire appeared on the newsstands, Uncle Willie, as businessman and sportsman McDonald referred to himself, bought the dubious rights to stage the Liston Clay fight in the Miami Beach Convention Hall. Perhaps it took a gambler and promoter like MacDonald to agree to pay the enormous sum of $625,000 for the live gate of a match that had sent so many other established boxing promoters fleeing for the doors. Why take the chance? He had the answer. For kicks. I'm in it for kicks. But beyond the sheer fun of the action, he sought to promote the image of America abroad. During the 1950s and 1960s, the Soviet Union openly ridiculed what it considered the hypocrisy of America's claims of freedom and equal opportunity. MacDonald thought, it would be great to show the world that two colored boys like Liston and Clay could fight in a southern city and be treated like kings. Although paternalism streaked through MacDonald's discussion of race, he praised Liston and Clay, emphasizing their gentlemanly qualities. But his liberalism stopped short of tolerance for the Nation of Islam. A MacDonald associate said, "Don't invite Uncle Willie and Malcolm X to the same party."
Context of White Supremacy. That will do it for the first audio segment. Folks have commentary they would like to share. Feel free to dial in the number 641-715-3640. The code is 564943 pound. Press star 6 if you would like to participate. The number again, 641-715-3640. The code 564943 pound. Press star 6 if you would like to participate. We are kind of close to the end, not super close, but midway. I'll say midway through chapter 10, midway through chapter 10. That's where we'll pick up at for the second audio segment. If you would like to participate and you don't want to use your phone to dial in, you can use the free VOP line. It is connected at Black Talk Radio Network. If you need the address, it is tiny.cc/1race, and that is the number 1. That address again, tiny.cc/1race, and that is the number 1. When you put in that address, look to the left of the page. You will see the link says VOP line. Click that. Open a small window on your screen. On the top line, it's a drop-down menu. Select the number that I just gave out, which again is 641-715-3640. Next line, it will ask for the code. That code again is 564943. Final line, it will ask for a name. You can use your real name, a nickname. You can press random keys, whatever you are comfortable with. Once you get all that information entered, click the green button at the bottom to connect you to the live broadcast. You should be able to hear us once you're connected. It is the same procedure if you would like to participate. You'll see the dial pad on your screen. Press star 6. Once you press star 6, you'll hear the audio prompt to press the number 1, and we will get you on the line. All the folks who dialed in who have a hand up should be with us. Feel free to chime in if you have commentary.
Yes, may I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Greetings, Gus. Greetings to the other callers and listeners. It's Henry Ford. I wrote a review on Amazon about this book, and I was stating that, two black icons in history, and they are both victims of racism, white supremacy. And the book talks about the deceptiveness of Muhammad Ali and insinuates that Malcolm X was using Muhammad Ali to avoid attempts on his life, which I question, that. But I wanted to use my time to talk about a couple of individuals. One, Drew Boudini Brown, who was his corner man and the guy that walked in his life. And if it's true that Muhammad Ali was dyslexic, then it's good that somebody like this guy shows up. This guy had been a corner man for Sugar Ray Robinson earlier, so he knew about the fight game, and he came in at a time that he could help Cassius Clay in the way that things were done in the ring. And the guy was responsible, for that float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. I'm surprised they hadn't mentioned that yet, but he stayed in his corner, and Muhammad Ali was his friend even until his death. But that guy was pretty influential, and the book just kind of briefly mentioned him. Another one was A.G. Gaston, the guy that owned the motel that was blown up when Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy was using his facilities. This guy was a great man. He started out, I believe, working in the mines, and he came up with the idea to put together some pennies for funeral expenses for people that lost their lives, and which evolved into a big insurance company. And by the time this guy died at 103 years old, his net worth was over $130 million. So he was just mentioned briefly, but we should note our, noteworthy black people. He dedicated a lot of money to civil rights and gave the use of his facilities for meetings, and a big supporter of civil rights, and I thought he should be mentioned. I'll take, give my time up for someone else. Thanks for taking the call.
For sure. That's a good idea. Write a review of any of these books, particularly if you want to write a review pointing out how any of the white authors that we have read, how the racism comes through in their books. That would be grand to get that on Amazon, or if you want to put it on your blog or wherever online. Other folks that we have not heard from, if you had commentary, feel free.
May I be heard?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. Hello to all the callers and listeners, and hello, Gus. I took a few notes here. I took a note that there are 24 African nations that gained independence from colonialism. And I also took a note about after Malcolm X gave the message to the grassroots, it was questioned how long he would stay with Elijah Muhammad. And so I have to research that and read that. I never read that, so I have to read that. And I also wrote down that Muhammad Ali, I don't know if he had an album, but maybe he was a singer. I don't know if he was just joking when he was on the Jack Parr show, but I took a note of that. And Malcolm X assigned someone to Muhammad Ali. And oh yes, and Malcolm X advised Muhammad Ali that he would have to break off from the LSG, those wealthy racist white supremacists that put him on in the first place. Malcolm X told him that he would have to separate from them eventually, break the chains. And I also took a note that it was going to be a sports section of Muhammad Speaks, but in the beginning, earlier in the book, was wrote that Elijah Muhammad really was not concerned with sports and things of that nature. So that was interesting that they were going to make a sports section of Muhammad Speaks. And this one here about Pretty and Handsome and what Muhammad Ali was saying about himself, and I think they were kind of saying maybe he was kind of questionably, could have been, maybe leaning towards homosexuality by saying that he was pretty and beautiful and not hardly using the word handsome. and I was watching a show out of Britain, and it was women that were saying they were looking in the mirror and they were checking themselves out, and then one woman asked another woman, was she handsome? And she was like, oh yes, you're handsome. These were females. This was on BBC. And when I read The Fire Next Time recently, I noticed that James Baldwin referred to this female minister as being handsome. So I'm going to have to look up and do some more research on the word handsome, because I know in America we use it for males, but it seems like maybe other places use it for females too, and looks. And I also took a note that Sonny Liston wanted peace. When he moved somewhere, a lot of houses went for sale, so I'm thinking that those are probably more than likely white people. And he said he wanted peace, and I was thinking, well, all of the people that are moving, that probably would not give you peace. So maybe that was a good thing that all those houses were going up for sale. And that was also interesting how Ali went to Liston's house. If I heard that right, it sounds like he went to his house to just fight him right outside like a regular fight, knowing that that man had, a criminal record, and he probably was on parole or probation or whatever, and he can get in trouble if he fought. And let's see. And my last note was the McDonald person that put up $625,000 to get that fight started. And he wanted to show the world that in Miami, now we're talking Miami, Florida, we're talking the beast of Florida. He wanted to show the world that Miami was willing to treat two black men like kings. And I was thinking, yeah, that's two black men out of Florida. They're not even from Florida. They're bringing these people in to supposedly treat them like kings, two black men. And then the rest of the black people in Florida, are subject to whatever, lynchings, murders, whatever. And those are the notes that I took from this reading. Very, very interesting book. I like this book. And that's all I have today so far.
For sure. I just wanted to make sure I got in Mr. McDonald. This is the white man who put the money up for the fight to happen in Florida. He called them colored boys, not black men. I thought that was important. I think Muhammad Ali's album is on YouTube, the album that you were referencing. I think you can check that out on YouTube. And Minister Malcolm's Message to the Grassroots speech from 1963, I think also is on YouTube in its entirety. I think we have played a portion from it on the program before, where he was talking about in detail about the March on Washington, as he called it, the Farce on Washington. That is also available on YouTube and many other places online if folks have not heard it before. It is a fascinating bit of oratory from Minister Malcolm. Other folks that we have not heard from, if you had commentary, you should be with us. Feel free.
Good evening, everyone. It's Carmen. I'm sorry. I guess I missed that last sentence. What did you say was a fascinating bit of oratory?
Minister Malcolm's Message to the Grassroots speech from 1963.
Okay. All right. I'll check that out. Thank you. Wow. I have not had a lot of personal experience with the Nation of Islam, but when I have tried to go and see people speak, I didn't feel like women were treated with that much respect. So for the most part, if we're together in public, I do treat them with, respect and courtesy and kindness and stuff. But other than that, if we're not in a public venue, they are mostly irrelevant to me, because I think that I may be irrelevant to them. It doesn't seem too much different from things the Christian religions like Jehovah's Witnesses, the shunning, and the shunning is really severe, separating you from your family and your children, and just really taking you through a lot of emotional turmoil. But I do understand the need to, when we're under siege, to police ourselves. Certainly not let the enemy police us. I do understand that, but I don't know. There's I guess these are just regular military tactics. I didn't see the relevance for that kind of military tactics with Jehovah's Witnesses, and I don't see that kind of necessary annihilation of your people in the Nation of Islam. I don't see why you need that. Why you need that decimation of your own troops, I guess, to pull everybody else in line. I don't know. It just doesn't seem like that's who we are. It doesn't really seem like that's our culture. That may be more of European culture, where you have to kill at least 10% of your troops so that everyone understands that, retreat is not an option. That really seems like European culture. It just doesn't seem like us. Other than them resembling some of the tactics of the Christian religions, they're irrelevant now also. But I don't know. I guess it's just everything just revolves around men. I'm not seeing anything, if they're not mentioning women, then women are irrelevant, and that is exactly how I feel, when I'm around them. And I guess that's just, I don't think that's a great thing. I don't think that's a great thing. Okay. Let's sit a little bit tangential, but that's my comment.
Right on. Other folks we have not heard from, if you had commentary, feel free.
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Greetings to you, Gus, and to all the callers and listeners. I missed a healthy portion of the first reading, but I did hear parts of it, and I wanted to just touch on, I think the first female caller talked about the questioning of Muhammad Ali's manhood and whatnot based on what the authors wrote in the book. And it made me think about the fact that us being trapped in this diabolical system has really even skewed our perceptions of what manhood is and what it looks like, because we've adopted white people's views of what manhood is. And just from the books that we've read and just my own personal study, what I find is that white manhood is defined by dominance, hyperaggression, and homosexuality. And I believe that any person who does not fit that mold of being hyper-aggressive and in a very overt kind of a way is automatically looked at as being homosexual or potentially having those tendencies. And I think because Muhammad Ali did not wear his manhood the way that white people have conditioned us to view manhood, that it's very easy, I think, for the people who did judge him in that manner to see him in that way. Whereas with my experience, especially when I've spent time around traditional African people who lived their existence as their ancestors did, I've noticed that manhood is exhibited in totally different ways, and it's almost like a quiet strength. And it's more of a spiritual component to it rather than overt aggression, and it's just a complete difference in the way that manhood is viewed and expressed via the traditional African model versus what we've been inculcated with in a system of white supremacy. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there. Just keep in mind, just as black people, just how much their influence on our manhood is. Just if you take a look at a lot of the music and videos and movies, that's how manhood is presented to us. And a lot of times we kind of go along with that because that's what we've been sitting with for 500 years. So I just wanted to give people just a little food for thought in regards to how we view manhood as black men and even black women because of how we were conditioned. Also, the one thing I did catch was what I believe was an act of racism being practiced by the author. It was on page 155, where he says, Liston understood what constituted an attractive contest. A boxing match is like the cowboy movie. There's got to be good guys and there's got to be bad guys. That's what the people paid for, to see the bad guy see the bad guy get beat. He understood his role. I'm the bad guy. Yet between Sonny's nefarious past and questionable present, and Cassius's incessant patter and black Muslim connections, there was no cowboy to wear the white hat. And when that line was read, I immediately thought of you, Gus, because you always talk about metaphors. And I was just like, wow, this one really stood out like a stop sign to me. And the fact that, of course, the good guys wear the white hat, which implies that white is right and white is pure and white is good. And it just really, it was something that was really subtle. But again, I really, really thank you for always imploring us to pay attention to metaphors and the connotations that come with metaphors when people use them, and most importantly, white people specifically. Thank you very much, and I'll mute my line there. And now that I'm here, I'll be able to chime in more for the second reading. Thank you very much.
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Greetings to everyone. Bear with me. I didn't take any notes. Here goes. First and foremost, once again, and I'm talking about the white people, in this case, I believe it was white males who wrote this book. White people have access to information more so than any other group of people in the world. And unfortunately, but not unexpectedly, with that information, they're going to always tweak the narrative to the level that it supports the global system of racism and white supremacy. And in their case, in subtle, very subtle ways. They can tell us about the system of racism and white supremacy and how to solve it within about 72 to 72 hours to a weekend. It doesn't take that long for them to do that. And these two white males I put up in that level of understanding. You can kind of like see it through the past readings and also tonight. Muhammad Ali and sexuality. Muhammad Ali, if one read something more than just this book, and also there were constant quotes from people who grew up with him. He was very dedicated to being the very best he can be as a fighter, almost since he was 12 years old. And from that standpoint, I mean, I'm not around here. I never knew him personally or anything like that. But what it presents to me, that he was very inexperienced from a sexual standpoint, as far as having sexual relations with a female. Which is not unusual for an athlete, not unusual for an athlete with his goals set in mind. And I mean, to give some evidence towards it, his first marriage, he got married after meeting somebody for probably less than a month. You know, and I mean, those 100 some odd questions that Mr. Fuller talks about, he probably would get a chance to ask 10 of them at that time because he was so inexperienced as far as, you know, marrying somebody. But in Miami, during that time, it may have been on paper as far as one can physically go anywhere they want, but definitely there were some places during that time that black people could not go to. If you were an entertainer, we're talking about, of course, before, what do they call that section of downtown, not downtown, but Miami Beach, South Beach, you know, that sort of thing. You had to have a passport still in order to go on that part of town. The only people that can go on that part of town, and if you was working there or you was a high-level, quote-unquote, celebrity. And then after you finish your work, get your black behind out of that section and go across to Juliet Tuttle or whatever other causeway it is and get back in Color Town. That was a rule. You were not going to be allowed to be able to wander up and down the streets and that sort of thing and frolic around and have a ball. Even when Ali won the title, he did not spend any time on South Beach after that fight. Right? The convention center they talk about is on Miami Beach. They've since torn it down and I don't know if they remodeled it. I don't even go over there, but that's basically how Miami Beach was back during that time. As I suspected, because I had read prior to, Malcolm did go to Minister Farrakhan. Well, he wasn't Minister Farrakhan at that time. He was Louis X at the time. But there was due to aid of white people, powerful white people in the FBI and other agencies, the death mark was already on Malcolm X at the time, at that particular point in time, and they had assistance from non-white black people who were confused on the global system of racist white supremacy, from the secretary, the head secretary, on down to the captain that was in the Temple number 7 at that time. And that's all I have to say. That's all I have to say, and thank you for listening.
For sure. Just want to remind folks, if you could watch the background noise, if you know you dialed in, you have a hand up, if you have, the radio, television, whatever happening in the background, use your mute button, then you can unmute yourself when you are ready to speak. That way we don't have a lot of distortion, what have you, in the line. Thank you kindly. Other folks that we have not heard from, anyone who dialed in that we have not heard from at all, did you have commentary?
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you for the platform, Gus. Greetings to the host, callers, and listeners. A few things stood out to me. The first thing was some of the wording where Malcolm referred to himself as a slave, and the way that Elijah Muhammad spoke about him disciplining him, Papa having to spank his son, that stood out. And just the, again, I was just paying attention to the way the author was very descriptive in his wording of the disagreement. That stood out. And the panic that Malcolm experienced, not really having financial security and realizing that could be, cut short. And I want to choose my words carefully with the next thing that I say, and not exhibit anti-blackness, but I do have to call it like I see it. From what I read in this chapter 9, Mr. Elijah Muhammad was conducting himself, not very, I would say, in the likeness of Allah. It seemed like he was really operating outside of that and just kind of fooling the rest of the people and operating how we know some of the white people to operate. And the last thing that stood out to me, the last thing that I'll speak on is the when Malcolm spoke out about Kennedy being assassinated and how he was kind of baited into kind of baited into saying something. And when the author described the mistake that he made, described it as a fatal mistake or a fatal flaw or something like that. That really stood out to me. And thanks for taking the call. I'm my line.
Yes, sir. Other folks that we have not heard from, if you had commentary you would like to share, feel free. Anyone that we have not heard from? Do we get everybody? Okay. We'll assume they are waiting until later. Hopefully we will get them in before we get to the second audio segment. Don't wait till the last minute. Some of the things that stood out that I wanted to make sure I got in before we get to the next, if anybody else has other comments that they want to make sure that they share. One of the first notes that I took this week, this is in Chapter 8, The Great Pretender, where the authors, where they say, as an auditory learner, Cassius was mesmerized by what he heard at Muslim meetings. Since childhood, when his father repeatedly told him tall tales, he had gravitated toward grand stories, legends, and myths. Muhammad's yarns about the big-head scientist Yaqub, the mothership, and white devils excited Cassius the same way that his father aroused his imagination. Muhammad's simple lessons that all white men were evil and all black men were good echoed his father's rants. I thought that was a really great encapsulation, I think, of a lot of what people have pointed out over the past month, I guess now, and today, about having suspected racists, these two white men writing this book about these black people and how their racism, that's what I suspect it is, comes through in the writing in a passage like that where at the time Cassius Clay is described as a child who is just fascinated with these nutty stories being told about evil white men and glorious black men and all this nonsense with the Nation of Islam. I think Thomas in New York pointed that out before, just the thinly veiled contempt for the Nation of Islam and their religious practices, and you just don't see that when people are talking about any white religious practices, particularly the religion of white supremacy. You don't see that, but just no seriousness at all that, these are just children, just little children being fascinated with this goofiness in the Nation of Islam, and that's really on the level that he can understand it, even though they try and play it back to, he was dyslexic and, he didn't have a lot of formal education, so this was something that his tiny Negro brain and intellect could grasp. That was very much the way it was conveyed to me. Next, where let's see. Again, at least in my opinion, the thing that should be front and center in this book is the FBI surveillance of this organization, particularly if you pay attention to the footnotes and if you hear the authors talk about this book. One of the things that they do play up in interviews is that they got a lot of information from FBI files and the surveillance files, the BOSS organization with the New York Police Department, and all of these other agencies, white enforcement agencies that are conducting all of this surveillance on the Nation of Islam, Mr. Malcolm, Muhammad Ali, and hordes of other black people who were involved in the civil rights movement, some of them who were not even involved in the civil rights movement, where it says the FBI Chicago field office filed a memorandum justifying the continued surveillance on Elijah Muhammad's mansion. The special agent in charge reported that surveillance had proven extremely valuable in covering the overall activities of the Nation of Islam. The Bureau had learned about the sex vulnerabilities and discovered that Cassius Clay, the well-known heavyweight title contender, had made arrangements to meet Elijah Muhammad and also to have his parents meet the messenger. I just don't think that can be underplayed. Even some of these passages where they're talking about, particularly when they start getting into the conflict between Minister Malcolm, Elijah Muhammad, these quotes that they're getting from Elijah Muhammad about things that he said or things that Malcolm X said, they got this stuff from FBI files, which to me just says they could have been the ones that are sitting there orchestrating all of this, even if this is, as they would call it, an organic conflict, like there was a legitimate problem between these two individuals. Racists are known. It is one of their legendary strategies. Come and go, there's a problem here. What can we do to make this worse? What can we do to get some killing going? What can we do to get somebody thrown in jail and to get, instead of it just being 2 black people that have a problem, what can we do to make this so that now it's, 100 black people are fighting amongst each other? Like, ooh, this is fantastic. It was really glaring for me going through and just pulling out some of the footnotes where these came from FBI files. Moving forward, I also thought it was significant where they write, Malcolm believed that Kennedy and the CIA were behind the murders of South Vietnamese President Dinh Diem and Congolese Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba. He also thought that Kennedy had sat passively while whites murdered blacks in the American South. The president's assassination was an inevitable result of America's culture of violence. I thought that passage right here is another illustration of the white authors could be them deliberately practicing racism. There's a lot of evidence that has come forward that the CIA was involved with the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. This is not just something out of the mind of Malcolm X, some nutty thought or idea or suspicion that he had. There's evidence to corroborate this. They don't include that. They did all this snooping around in the FBI files and did all this reading of information. They read Carl Evans' book. He brings that forward in his book, The Judas Factor. I've read that. They didn't make an effort to say, well, there is other evidence to support that he was correct on this. Even as they continue with the passage where it says also Malcolm X thought that Kennedy had sat passively while whites murdered blacks in the American South. Again, this is not just something that Malcolm X thought. This is true. This is well documented, and many, many folks other than Malcolm X took the exact same position, including now Congressman John Lewis, where he was extremely critical of the Kennedy administration, the speech that he gave at the March on Washington 1963, where there was so much controversy about his speech. They were not going to let him speak. They had to edit and redact his speech because he was so critical of the Kennedy administration, because they had sent FBI agents down to the South, Alabama and other places, Mississippi, where they were demonstrating, and they did sit passively by while black people were being beaten, killed, mauled by enforcement officials, and did nothing. This is the same time period after Bull Connor had just turned those fire hoses on black children in Birmingham, Alabama, and they did do nothing. So it just, in my opinion, again, making it seem as though this is just something in the mind of Malcolm X, as opposed to, no, this is established fact. This is not just the opinion of some wild radical Negro. Moving forward, even the passage where it says that some of Elijah Muhammad's concerns about Minister Malcolm's comments, the chickens coming home to roost with the Kennedy assassination, Elijah Muhammad thinking that this could provoke even more attention from the FBI, just, again, the gargantuan nature of the surveillance that all these people were subjected to, and how that ends up damaging not only your mental health, but it can really constrict your thinking. It can be very suffocating in a very real sense, not just metaphorically speaking, where you're paranoid, and for good reason, not, just because I'm crazy or mentally unstable, but because I know I'm being watched. I know I'm under surveillance. I know they're listening to our phone calls. So it can become very difficult about what do you say, who do you trust, how do we try to operate constructively in this environment where we're subjected to just constant harassment and people listening in and stalking, watching our every move. Another one of the sections where it says, where Elijah Muhammad is in quotes talking about how Papa had to spank his son. These quotes come from an FBI file. Right? These seem like very intimate conversations where apparently either they have electronic surveillance or they have paid informants who are there to give them all of this direct private information, or it could be both, electronic and having actual people there. But just, again, I think that should be at the forefront of this book, what these people were subjected to. Let's see. There was another one, this phone conversation, where it says on July 2nd, 1964, during a tense phone conversation, Elijah scolded Malcolm. I've been hearing about Malcolm this and Malcolm that, and even Malcolm began being called a leader. Muhammad fumed. You made an error, he said harshly. Again, this comes from FBI files, which, suggests a very deep level of infiltration. Let's see, the next one. Just to Karma's point, where they're talking about Captain Joseph, where he pled guilty to assaulting his wife. It just, from what's been in this book, and it's not just this book, it's not like I can put this on the suspected racism of these co-authors, because I've read this many times over. Carl Evans is a black male, and a lot of this information is in that book as well. Just this environment where you can have these sort of abuses of other black people, black females, and black males, just extremely toxic, in my opinion, and just calls for, again, to remind anyone listening, first time, last time, as Mr. Fuller has said, there should be like zero tolerance for any form of beating, abusing black females. I think that's something that has contributed to us not being able to solve this problem and just continues to generate a lot of conflict. That should just be zero, absolute. First time, last time, we're just not going to continue that. We're all frustrated under the system of white supremacy, but we're not going to encourage anything that is taking it out on other victims of racism. Again, the FBI piece, where it says even when he was inside his hotel room, this is Minister Malcolm, he did not feel safe. He suspected that the FBI had bugged the room, fear exacerbated by a radio broadcast he had heard just before the meeting, claiming falsely, as it turned out, that the FBI and Rochester police considered him a suspect in an assassination plot against President Lyndon Johnson. And I just don't think that that sort of thing can be taken lightly when you're not just thinking that you're being bugged, under surveillance. You are worldwide, no matter where you go, and then they can make these sort of baseless accusations against you at any time, and just how that impacts your mental health, how that can just drain your energy and make it so difficult for you to function in an environment that is already rife with white supremacy, anti-blackness, and just terrorism against black people. To then have to deal with all of this, it is amazing what all these folks had to deal with. Another act of racism on the authors, in my opinion, they have a photograph in chapter 10. It's of, at the time, Cassius Clay, his father, Cassius Marcellus Clay Sr. He's holding up a picture of some of his artwork, and they have captioned the photograph. It reads, Clay's father was a frustrated artist who was convinced that white men had stunted his career. His rage shaped the man that his son became, but the father also resented the influence of the Nation of Islam had over his eldest child. The system of racism, white supremacy, has stunted the career of every single black person, every single non-white person who has ever existed under the system of white supremacy. Either that's true or it's false. I'm just making a flat statement. That would include President Obama. That would include First Lady Michelle Obama. That would include Patrice Lumumba. Anybody else you want to name, including Muhammad Ali, Cassius Clay. So certainly for his father living at this time, that's just not, again, the grumblings of some nutty old black person trying to blame whites for everything. That is a statement of actual fact. For him to grow up in Kentucky at this time, even if he had been in Massachusetts or somewhere on the continent of Africa or wherever in the world, that would be a true statement. It would still be true today, 2016, if the system of white supremacy exists. I will stop there. We have about 10 minutes before we get to the next audio segment. Did folks, anybody that we missed have commentary that they wanted to make sure they get in? Anybody that we missed have commentary?
Yeah, Thomas Smith from New York. Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Yes, I enjoyed this first reading much more than the rest of the reading so far. I had a flow to it. However, I hate the fact that it's these white authors. You could definitely tell they're writing it from a white supremacist perspective. And, I never really looked at it from the way you just put it. But, yeah, I mean, to know that the FBI and CIA or whatever is on you, and, it's not even, I think this is still the J. Edgar Hoover time. I mean, it's not even a second thought, they're bugging you, they're spying on you, that they had to be under extreme pressure. And I think that caused a lot of decisions, the bad decisions that they made to be made, from both Malcolm and from Elijah Muhammad. However, one thing that stood out immensely was, I do notice that although I love Malcolm immensely, he does do a lot of that tough talking, but I mean, I don't think he really put it in perspective that, the South and the North is two completely different places, especially in 1960s. And, when he's ridiculing the way it came, and the civil rights all-stars over there were handling the terrorism they were under. Their hands were, I hate to use the metaphor, but their hands were tied, especially in the South. There wasn't a big city with 1 million black people in it, like, in the North, or, a few 100,000 black people. I mean, this is pretty spread out, and the laws and everything were totally against you. So I think that for him to ridicule them for that was really him not putting things in perspective and just doing a lot of tough talking. I mute my line.
That sounds pretty close to Jackie Robinson's assessment last week, if memory serves. Might even be classified tough talk. Some might even call that rhetoric. Anybody that we missed? Make sure anybody that didn't get a chance to speak at all. All righty. Anybody else, regardless if you spoke or not? Anybody else have additional commentary?
Hello?
Yes, sir.
I wanted to jump on and piggyback off of Roz's comment earlier about the white hat. It reminded me of the saying, if it's white, it's right. I also wanted to throw out there, if anybody didn't know, there's a movie called Phantom Punch on Sonny Liston's life, just in case anybody wanted to get any more information on him. And I also wanted to kind of note that, Malcolm never needed anybody to kind of bait him into answering any questions. He kind of, spoke what he felt, and that was part of his greatness. And I'm making that statement as into, how the reporters seemed like they were kind of trying to bait him into answering the questions about JFK. And I also wanted to know if anybody knew of the actions taken against the Honorable Elijah Muhammad's son, Wallace, for him coming out about his infidelity issues. And I'll mute my line.
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Yes, several additional things. If you follow the pattern of J. Edgar Hoover, he is very consistent on his means to destroy any effort, whether it's forwallism or in the system of racist white supremacy. He's very consistent, starting with Marcus Garvey versus the non-white black male, I forgot his name, that started the NAACP with the Niagara movement.
W.E.B. Du Bois.
Say his name, Gus. Yes. If you can listen to the phone conversation between Huey P. Newton and Eldridge Cleaver, it's almost identical to what was read in the previous reading between Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm. It's almost identical. You would have thought of the same conversation, the way it went between the two, which destroyed the Black Panther Party, which was the final destruction of the Black Panther Party. And he had a means of constantly manipulating these efforts by black people, and in turn he would use sex, perhaps because of his sexual deviancy himself. He was, quote unquote, a closet homosexual, but very consistent pattern that he always had. Another situation that was going on with the Nation of Islam, there was a lot of business that was being functioned by the Nation of Islam. A lot of it was for them to expand monetary wise and business wise that Malcolm X knew only a little about, where they were actually dealing directly with white people who were openly a part of white supremacist groups at the time. I'm close to saying the Ku Klux Klan, because there was on one occasion where Malcolm actually played a part in a business transition down in, I believe, Atlanta, Georgia, something like that. But even beyond that, because they kind of like cut him out. The Chicago side of the Nation of Islam was the controlling element, and they basically cut him out of a lot of things. But they did have him to go down south in that one occasion. So with Malcolm X being with his personality and his means to speak in his mind on what he thought was correct things, and also represent a Nation of Islam, that was kind of like, once again, fostered by, as you mentioned, the FBI, along with other white supremacist efforts. And as we're reading right now, we are witnessing the demise of Malcolm X at the time. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
And can I add, I also have to give a lot of credit. It's a lot of criticism for what the Nation of Islam did. I remember when I grew up, there was like a steak and take or something that was owned by the Muslims. They still have their newspaper, The Final Call, that they, I support when I see the brother in the the train station with it. But, these wasn't college educated, master degree, Harvard educated dude. These was, regular old black people with the Jim Crow education, street education, that put something together that big at the time under the scrutiny they were under, the surveillance they were under. So for a lot to focus on what they did bad, I mean, they put together probably one of the top 5 black organizations ever in this country that especially after slavery, with members all throughout the country, businesses throughout the country, and it's still around today. So they did do a lot.
Especially businesses. They were very proficient. As I heard Malcolm X say, their businesses were also patronized by white people. Of the cleanliness, as far as the restaurants that you would go to, and at one point in time, they also owned a fishing refinery where they were selling fish, so yes, they were pretty productive as far as amongst other non-white black people's efforts.
Anybody else? Any final comments they wanted to make sure they got in before we get ready to conclude?
Yes, I wanted to piggyback off of Thomas in New York. I completely agree with him with the anti-blackness that Mr. Malcolm expressed in speaking so harshly against Dr. King and the nonviolent movement. One thing I wanted to say in reference to him speaking rhetorically is that when you look at the chronology of those times where that took place, essentially it was Elijah Muhammad who told him he could not, not to go in that direction. So even though, and they talk about this earlier in the text as well, the fact that Malcolm knew he had black people that were angry enough to start something, but Elijah really pushed him in a direction of avoiding confrontation as much as possible. And that's where I think the rhetorical aspect of his conversation comes from, because a lot of times you can even hear it, even through these racist writers, his frustration with Elijah's inaction in reference to different incidences that were taking place with black people, both within the nation as well as outside of the nation. So it's not, from what I'm seeing, I could be wrong, I don't think that Malcolm himself wanted to remain nonviolent. I think if Elijah allowed him to move forward with something like that, he probably would have. Just from the fact that, from what I've studied, he seemed highly frustrated with Elijah's approach to the black struggle and him separating that from the Nation of Islam. And then also the fact that just from what we're learning about Elijah Muhammad, he himself had a lot of questionable characteristics. And also he understood the system of white supremacy in a way in which he understood there was only so far you can go against the white man, no matter how much you're preaching against them, before, they'll come after you in the way in which you will not be able to escape. And that's all I wanted to contribute. Thank you.
For Sure. We will pause here. If you have additional comments, you can just jot a note down, and we should have ample time once the second audio segment concludes for folks to continue with the discussion. But again, we're picking up chapter 10, kind of the midway point, Trouble in Miami. If you, as I said, didn't get to share, we'll be sure to just get your hand up at the very beginning as soon as we go to the phone line so you can share once the second audio segment is done. Context of White Supremacy. This is Randy Roberts and Johnny Smith's Blood Brothers, the fatal friendship between Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X. Context of White Supremacy, audio segment number 2.
The idea of Malcolm running into Uncle Willie at a cocktail party in Bal Harbor or the Fontainebleau Hotel seemed unlikely. But he would have found a warmer welcome there than in New York, where his troubles with Elijah Muhammad weighed heavily on his mind. Malcolm needed to get away. His phone rang non-stop, with press calls, dogging him with questions about his future. The man who had always had an answer for reporters was now unsure what to tell them. Tortured by his separation from the nation, his mind randomly jumped among Elijah, Captain Joseph, President Kennedy, his mosque, the press, and death threats. It was all too much. On Wednesday, January 15th, the morning after his late-night writing session with Alex Haley, he reached for the phone to call a friend. But before he could dial the number, it rang. Joseph K. Ponder, an FBI agent from the Buffalo field office, was on the line with a few questions. "Where were you last night? Do you know anything about a plot by the black Muslims to assassinate Lyndon Johnson? How long will your suspension from the nation last?" Ponder seemed especially interested in Malcolm's future with the sect. After the call from Ponder, the phone rang again. A reporter from the New York Times also wanted to know if there was any truth about the plot to kill the new president. "The whole idea is ridiculous," Malcolm declared. For an hour, reporters from all over the country dialed his number, inquiring about the assassination rumors and his suspension. Finally, the phone stopped ringing. After being badgered for an hour, Malcolm turned to a personal matter and called a friend in Miami to tell him that he was bringing Betty and their children to visit. "That's the best news I've heard all day," Cassius Clay said. "Me and Brother Archie will pick you up." After the call ended, an FBI agent listening to their conversation contacted the Miami field office and instructed agents to tail a 1963 Chrysler with Florida license plate 1E16521. The New York agent stressed that it was important that they follow the car to the airport the next day and determine the purpose of the subject's activities in Miami. The next morning, Cassius and Archie Robinson greeted Malcolm and his family at the airport. Smiling as he shook Malcolm's hand, Clay showed no fear of being seen with the suspended minister, whom he called his brother. After he hugged Sister Betty and lifted her 3 little girls up into his arms, Cassius, Archie, and Malcolm's family packed into the Chrysler and headed to Brownsville, a segregated middle-class black neighborhood. Sam Saxon, the Miami mosque captain since the late 1950s, was a little surprised to see Malcolm. Clay's fight against Liston was still more than a month away. Malcolm told his brothers in Miami that he and Betty were celebrating their first vacation in more than 6 years. But he wasn't on vacation. Malcolm, Saxon soon realized, had another agenda in mind. Malcolm and his family checked into the Hampton House Motel on Northwest 27th Avenue. A popular retreat for black tourists and locals, some of the most famous figures in America had booked one of the balconied rooms. Considered more glamorous than the black hotels in Overtown, the Hampton House was a resort, featuring valet parking, a courtyard swimming pool, a restaurant, and a jazz club, famous for its mixed-race sessions, lasting until sunrise. When he was not in training, Clay visited the Hampton House and played with Malcolm's daughters, teasing them like a big brother. Watching Cassius entertain them made Malcolm smile, and, for a moment, forget all about his troubles. "I liked him," Malcolm later admitted. "Betty liked him. Our children were crazy about him." Watching her husband interact with Cassius, Betty could see that Malcolm loved him like a younger brother. Cassius brought out Malcolm's warm, playful side. The minister laughed as he snapped pictures of the boxer, clowning for his camera. But the pictures Malcolm took were not for a family photo album. In a private notebook, he began constructing photo captions and a narrative he entitled The Other Side of Malcolm, the Family Man. The notebook and accompanying photos of Cassius, Malcolm, and his daughters, which were published in 2 black newspapers, the Chicago Defender and the New York Amsterdam News, suggest that he had begun to fashion a less threatening image of himself, one of a loving father and husband and an older brother to Cassius, someone more acceptable in the mainstream civil rights movement. It was also no coincidence that the pictures were published in the 2 cities where his enemies in the nation could not miss them. In the early evenings, Malcolm walked with Cassius on the streets of Brownsville, while FBI agents trailed closely behind. In all the time that they had spent together, in storefront mosques and crowded temples, in private meetings and family gatherings, Malcolm had learned that Cassius was an impressionable, inquisitive youngster who absorbed everything that he taught. Cassius, he recognized, was perfect for his plan. He was a one-man publicity machine, capable of attracting Malcolm's desired audience, young, idealistic, angry black men. Cassius, Malcolm told a reporter, has as much untapped mental energy as he has physical power. He possessed incredible potential to be something much more than a boxer. Studying Cassius with a crowd of journalists and a mob of black admirers, Malcolm could imagine him as a political force, someone who should be a diplomat, traveling the world with him, galvanizing a human rights movement at home and abroad. Whether Malcolm returned to the nation or not, Cassius was ideally suited to follow him, to use his platform as a boxer to mobilize poor, disenfranchised black Americans. Cassius, Malcolm noticed, knows how to handle people, to get them functioning. He gains strength from being around people. He could draw people in, shape their perceptions, and make them believe what Malcolm wanted them to believe. Nothing seemed to rattle Clay. "He has tremendous self-confidence," Malcolm observed. "I've never heard him mention fear." Perhaps he did not realize the depth of Malcolm's problem. His public relationship with Malcolm irritated the nation's officials in Chicago, especially Elijah Muhammad. The Supreme Minister had directed all followers to avoid the censured minister, but Cassius had disobeyed him. In Miami, Malcolm became convinced that his future with the nation depended on Clay winning the heavyweight championship. While most doubted his chances of beating Liston, Malcolm bolstered Clay's inner strength, telling him that he was too smart, too fast, and too big to lose the fight. And Allah, he preached, had ordained that Clay would win. He believed in Clay so much that he called Alex Haley in New York and told him that if Haley bet on his friend, the underdog, he would win big. This fight was more than just another athletic contest. It was part of his larger plan. Clay would not just win, he would deliver a message inspired by Malcolm. Malcolm's message sounded to Clay like a voice from a burning bush. At a moment when the world seemed to doubt him, the man Cassius greatly admired never lost faith. Malcolm filled him with confidence, and if he said that Allah had ordained a victory, then it must be true. Malcolm, Cassius believed, only spoke the truth. But he told him a lie, the same lie that he told reporters and himself, that he would be reinstated within 90 days. Malcolm was living in the past. At some level, he must have realized that he would never return to the nation, but he still held out hope that he would reconcile with Elijah. He desperately wanted to believe it, and he convinced Cassius. Throughout January and early February, he wrote the messenger, pleading for reinstatement, but he received only silence from Chicago. Most likely, Malcolm's enemies intercepted his letters before they ever reached Elijah. The silence troubled him, making him even more desperate to do something to restore his place in the nation. The only thing that Angelo Dundee knew about Malcolm X was what he had read in the papers, and he mostly read the sports pages. He knew that Malcolm had said something incendiary about President Kennedy, But he did not realize that the man reporters described as the violently anti-white New York chief of the Muslims would be in Miami celebrating Cassius's 22nd birthday. Seeing him in the flesh made the trainer nervous. Malcolm wore a broad, casual smile that never touched his eyes, a mask that seemed more threatening than friendly. But nothing startled Angelo more than when he saw Cassius involved in a deep conversation with Malcolm X. Sam Saxon was similarly surprised to see Malcolm hanging around the gym. He knew that the suspended minister was not there to trade small talk. Earlier, Malcolm had asked him, "If I go over to the gym, would I hurt Brother Cassius?" "Hell yeah, man. Everybody knows you," Captain Sam replied. He suggested that Malcolm go nowhere near 5th Street. Malcolm said nothing, but a few hours later, he showed up at the gym. Saxon noticed that whenever reporters came around to see Cassius, Malcolm talked to them. And any time a photographer snapped photos of the contender, Malcolm maneuvered in front of the camera. Malcolm knew exactly what he was doing. If Elijah never accepted him back into the nation, then he had to consider an exit strategy that would force Cassius to walk in his shoes. Talking to reporters while photographers took his picture with Cassius violated the terms of his suspension. More importantly, he understood that all Muslims, including Cassius, were prohibited from speaking with him. If anyone in Chicago learned that Clay had disobeyed the messenger, perhaps Elijah would have no choice but to punish the boxer too. Then Cassius would clearly understand Elijah's vindictive nature, and Malcolm would not have to convince him of it. It seemed like a good plan, but Elijah didn't fall for the trap. Angelo suspected that Malcolm was up to something, but was not sure what. He seldom pried into Cassius's private life, but when outsiders stepped into his gym, his sanctuary, and disrupted training, he voiced his displeasure. This was no time for distractions, he told Clay. They were about a month away from the biggest fight of his career. He refused to let anyone, especially some guy named X, cost Clay the title. Dundee had already started losing patience with Cassius. Sometimes the boxer simply ignored his instructions. It seemed that he didn't listen to anybody except the Muslims, and now he was looking to Malcolm for training advice, financial counsel, and emotional support. It was nearly impossible to carry on an actual conversation with him. "Nobody ever talks with Cassius," Clay's fight doctor Ferdy Pacheco observed. "You listen to him. This man, known all over the world for his mouth, can't even converse. You don't get an exchange of ideas. He doesn't even hear you." Pacheco was wrong on one point. Clay heard who he wanted to hear. When Dundee saw Cassius talking with Malcolm, he pulled his boxer into a corner of the gym and made sure that he heard him clearly. "Get that guy out of here," he said. Clay assured him that Malcolm was leaving town the next night. What he didn't tell Angelo was that he was going with him. On Tuesday, January 21st, 2 days after Betty and the children departed Miami, Malcolm, Cassius, and Archie Robinson flew to New York. Malcolm was worried about going home. In Harlem, where he once ruled the streets, he now had to look over his shoulder. He was not entirely sure who he could trust at Mosque No. 7. Searching to find some way to defend himself, he wrote in his journal, he had to retaliate against those enemies without hurting Elijah. He knew that he was not safe around the mosque or the Rockland Palace Ballroom on 155th Street and 8th Avenue, where the Fruit of Islam had planned a dinner. So he sent Cassius Clay to the dinner in his place. On their flight from Miami, Malcolm had tutored Cassius, outlining a speech for him and explaining that some Muslims might not approve of their friendship, and the two had continued to rehearse the speech at Malcolm's home in Long Island. Malcolm told Cassius that he wished he could go with him, but that was not possible, because he had a prior engagement. In front of about 1,200 Muslims, Clay delivered what Archie Robinson claimed was an impromptu speech. "There wasn't anything planned," Malcolm's aide falsely insisted. "I'm a race man," Clay began, "and every time I go to a Muslim meeting, I get inspired." The crowd thundered with applause as Cassius grinned with gratification. I'm a free man, and I'm talking so much because of the Muslims' teachings. Sonny Liston, according to Cassius, was not a race man like him. In poetry, he attacked his opponent as a race traitor, living next door to white people. He's not doing as he should, because he lives in a white neighborhood. And because he doesn't like black, I'm going to put him on his back. Again, a loud burst of laughter and applause. Cassius insisted that because he was a Muslim, he was purer than Liston, too. He didn't smoke, didn't drink, and had never been arrested like Sonny. I'm training on lamb chops, and that big ugly bear is training on pork chops. Then Cassius walked into a bear trap. He announced that he'd had another advantage during training in Miami, the wisdom imparted by his brother, Malcolm X. When Cassius declared that he was proud to walk the streets with Malcolm, the mood of the evening changed. The crowd was stunned. No one in the mosque talked publicly about Malcolm, let alone called him brother. An informant told the FBI that the Muslims were very cold towards Cassius for defending Minister Malcolm, especially after the messenger had said to put him down. When William C. Sullivan, the assistant director of the FBI, learned about Clay's presence at the Muslims' dinner, he concluded that the boxer had joined the Nation of Islam. A few weeks earlier, Sullivan had circulated a memo among leading FBI officials encouraging a counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO, to discredit Malcolm, Elijah Muhammad, Martin Luther King, and other prominent black figures. Special agents working in the Bureau's covert program had infiltrated organizations like the Nation of Islam, disrupted their activities through wiretaps, surveillance, forged documents, and blackmail, and planted false media stories. Armed with information about Clay's affiliations, Sullivan tipped off the press and added his name to a list of NOI targets. The day after his speech, reports about Clay and the Muslims appeared in New York newspapers. The Herald Tribune's Dick Schopp, who had known Cassius since his amateur boxing days, was not sure if the fighter was a card-carrying Muslim, but he had no doubt that he sympathized with the nation. If Clay shares the anti-white sentiments of the black Muslims, he wrote, he has always disguised his feelings well. Although he had interviewed Malcolm in the past, when Schopp investigated the minister's relationship with the boxer, he learned very little. Malcolm won't say anything publicly, an acquaintance told Schopp, and the one subject he won't talk about even privately is Cassius Clay. While Malcolm remained in New York, Cassius returned to Miami, where reporters pressed him for details about his trip. Promoter Bill McDonald said that Clay swore by all that's holy that he was not a member of the nation. I'm not a black Muslim any more than you are, he told the Miami Herald's Pat Putnam. The Harlem dinner was not an exclusive NOI affair either, he claimed. Members of the NAACP and Congress of Racial Equality had attended the event, too. Yet his relationship with the nation had just deepened significantly. The truth was that he had discarded his slave name, Clay, and received his X from Chicago. In the nation, he was now officially Cassius X. Clearly, Malcolm was not the only Muslim betting on the heavyweight contender. His denials fooled few reporters. They had seen him with Malcolm. While writers could not understand why he would associate with a man who had spoken so cruelly about the deceased president, Clay feigned ignorance. If Malcolm said that about President Kennedy, then he should be shot too, he said. I knew he said something about chickens coming home to roost, but that's all I heard. That could not have been all he heard. Malcolm spent days in Miami and talked with Cassius for hours. He knew exactly why Malcolm had time for a vacation. While Malcolm may not have disclosed the details about his deteriorating relationship with Muhammad, Cassius had close ties with various NOI officials who talked with him regularly and would have spoken of the tensions between the suspended minister and Muhammad. Clay's ignorance about the nation's politics was just another act. He knew that he was harboring a renegade Muslim. Talking to reporters, Cassius tried to finesse his opinions, staking out territory between the civil rights movement and the Nation of Islam. "I don't believe in hate," he said. "I don't believe in violence. I don't believe in forced integration. I believe the important thing is knowing where you belong and where you don't belong. Then the farmers won't come out with pitchforks, the cops won't come with the clubs, and the firemen won't come out with hoses." Then he said something that sounded like it came directly from one of Malcolm's speeches. "All I know is that I'm black, and my people are catching hell. I want some answers." The questions surrounding Cassius's relationship with Malcolm troubled McDonald, Dundee, and the Louisville sponsoring group. With disappointing ticket sales, they worried that too many fans would avoid the convention center in protest of his involvement with Malcolm and the black Muslims. To counter the bad publicity, on Saturday night, January 25th, he sparred for 9 rounds at the Miami Beach Auditorium to raise money for a cerebral palsy organization. It was an attempt to repair his image and remind the public that he was just a nice, sweet kid. Yet, if McDonald and the LSG urged Clay to stop speaking his mind, he wasn't listening. Still weeks away from the championship fight, reporters needed stories to fill their columns, and they knew that Clay's conversion to the nation was a sensational scoop. Like bloodhounds on the trail, the best writers in the country followed the scent, all the way to Miami. They needed few detective skills. Cassius was tired of running from reporters, weary of hiding the truth. "Sure, I talked to the Muslims," he admitted, "and I'm going back again. I like the Muslims." Lying on a massage table with a masseuse kneading his shoulders, Cassius relaxed while reporters asked him questions. Contrary to news reports, he was not brainwashed. He could see and think for himself. "In Cleveland, the Negroes tried to integrate, and you could see what happened," he said. "The white people hit the Negroes, and the Negroes hit the white people." Rising from the table, throwing wild punches, and covering his face with his arms, he exclaimed, "Bam, bam! Bam, bam!" The racial violence only proved what he had already learned from Muslim ministers. Integration wasn't just wrong, it was dangerous. The writers peppered him with questions. "Are you actually a member of the Nation of Islam?" one asked. "I was born a Muslim, I'm told. My race descended from the people in Egypt and Africa, whose religion had always made them Muslim." For the first time, writers heard him connect the struggles of black Americans and colonized Africans. It upset him that the Africans are treated better in this country than the American Negro. The Negro was not treated like an American, he said, echoing Malcolm. Cassius denied that the Muslims preached hatred. "I'm not mad at the white people. If they like me, I like them." But a closer look at his childhood showed that he held deep suspicions toward whites. His father maintained that the black Muslims had indoctrinated his boys ever since Cassius returned from Rome an Olympic champion, teaching them to hate all white people, to hate women, and to hate their mother. Clay Sr. was always stirring up trouble, and some of the Muslims in his son's camp thought that he interfered too much. Sometimes he argued with them, shouting that they were a bunch of crooks robbing his family. He could not abide hearing his boys talk about the nation either. When they did, he erupted, "Don't talk that Muslim stuff." He complained that the black Muslims kept him away from his boys because the nation feared that he would drag them right back to church. But nothing irritated him more than when his youngest son called collect, identifying himself as Rudolph X. "I don't know no Rudolph X," he yelled at the operator, slamming the phone. In Miami, an FBI informant called the Herald's Pat Putnam, telling him that some Muslims had threatened to kill Clay's parents. Putnam wondered if the combustible father might want to talk about it, so he arranged for an interview in a restaurant across the street from the 5th Street gym. For nearly 3 hours, Clay Sr. ranted about how the Muslims had ruined his boys, stole money from his son, and threatened to take him out on a boat and drown him. He felt shoved aside by Malcolm, replaced by a man who sneered at him. He despised the way his sons worshipped Malcolm. "You should have seen them all," he said. "They did everything but bow and kiss his feet." Rudy's and Cassius's membership in the nation angered him so much that he threatened to whoop both of them and Malcolm. Cassius paid him no mind. "I don't care what my father said," he insisted. "I'm not interested. I'm not talking." Putnam learned quickly that he had better stop asking Clay Sr. about the Muslims. After the story was published, someone called his house, warning him that he and his wife were going to die. Putnam did not recognize the voice on the other end of the line, but he got the message. Late one night, he drove out to Clay's house and told him about the death threats. He had known Cassius since he first started training in Miami and had always gotten along with him. Clay reassured him, "Pat, don't worry about it. You'll never get another call." Putnam never knew what Clay did, but he received no more death threats. By the third week in January, America's thoughts had started to tilt toward South Florida. Brutally cold winds ripped across the Midwest and Northeast. "Death and misery mounting," proclaimed a headline. In the worst blizzard of the year, snow drifted 12 feet and more from the Mississippi to the Atlantic seaboard, stranding drivers, challenging walkers, and generally making life uncomfortable. Miami beckoned. The Miami Herald reported that the top syndicate bosses were among the recent arrivals. Paul the Waiter Rico, Sam Mooney Giancana, and Felix Milwaukee Phil Aldersino escaped the slush of Chicago for the sand of Miami. There they waited out the worst of the winter, looking forward to watching Sonny button the Louisville lip. Liston's National Airlines flight from Las Vegas arrived in Miami shortly before noon on January 26th. He stepped off the plane, relaxed and wearing a champion smile, but neither lasted long. Waiting for Sonny, Clay shouted insults and challenges. "I'm the champ, you're the chump," he screamed, whipping his tuxedo jacket about like a war flag. "Let's fight now. I want my title." Liston fixed Clay with that evil look and told him, "Look, this clowning isn't cute, and I'm not joking." Liston refused to give Cassius the satisfaction of another glance, but his ceremonial arrival and press conference were in tatters. To bypass the commotion, Sonny boarded a VIP golf cart and raced toward the interview room. Clay sprinted behind, screaming insults and waving an African walking stick. In a tunnel, Liston told the driver to stop. "Listen, you little punk. I'll punch you in the mouth. This has gone too far." Then, as Clay continued his taunts, Liston swung at him, missing with a wild right. In the melee that followed, Sonny's wife, Geraldine, got whacked on the head, his manager, Jack Nyland, threatened to fight the entire mob, and the champion lost his cool. The door to the interview room was shut and locked. Inside, Liston steamed, glaring at the door that separated him from Clay. Outside the room, Cassius shouted, "It's a free country. You can't stop me from coming in." Brandishing his cane, he banged the locked door and continued, "Free? You think I'm jiving, chump? I'll fight you free, right here." Red-faced, MacDonald apologized. He told Sonny that he hoped the champion would knock out Clay in 3 rounds. Regaining his customary sang-froid, Liston claimed that Clay's act didn't upset me, but it got kind of, even iron wears out. Then, with the interview concluded, policemen escorted Liston out a back door and whisked him away in a car. Liston had said that it didn't bother him, but it did. He had traveled a long way from a sharecropper shack in Arkansas and the whippings of a cruel father. He had survived the streets, prison, and the police of Missouri and Pennsylvania. Unable to read or write, he preferred violence as his medium of expression. But as journalist Jerry Eisenberg noted, Sonny was illiterate, but he wasn't ignorant or stupid or unfeeling. There was a sort of dignity to his sullen, brutal life. He accepted who he was and the fact that people regarded him as a thug. As the heavyweight champion of the world, he did not ask for love or popularity. Still, he thought he deserved some semblance of respect. That, of course, was precisely what Cassius Clay denied him. Socially and culturally, Cassius transformed the title fight into a contest about many things: beauty, age, law and order, and race, but dignity was not on the list. There was hardly a quiet corner of Liston's life that Cassius did not invade. For instance, Sonny designed a training program with the production qualities of a Las Vegas show. Setting up shop at the Surfside Civic Arena, overlooking the sea in North Miami Beach, he charged 50 cents to watch him train. The session struck George Plimpton as well worth the modest cost. They began with a 20-minute official film of Liston's destruction of Patterson in Las Vegas. When the film ended, an assistant removed the screen, revealing the champion, standing still and expressionless in a ring elevated on a stage. The combination of his immobile face, massive body, and fearsome reputation sent ripples of applause through the audience. Only then did Sonny begin his workouts. He shadowboxed, gliding across the ring with a sparring partner, each throwing punches, bobbing and weaving, feinting and ducking, but never making the slightest contact during their choreographed performance. Next, he punched a speed bag with a rat-a-tat-tat syncopation, and the heavy bag with a thud-thud-thud demonstration of rib-breaking power. After pounding the bags, it was time for Liston to receive some punishment. His trainer, Willie Reddish, picked up a 15-pound medicine ball and threw it with all his considerable strength at the champion. The ball seemed to explode into Sonny's stomach, but without the slightest change in expression, he trapped it on the rebound. While the exertions exhausted Reddish, they hardly seemed to interest Liston. The last exercise was the capstone of the show. To the soulful beat of Night Train, he skipped rope, man and music in perfect harmony. "Note," an announcer said, "the champion's heels never touch the board. He does it all on his toes." It was almost too much for the spectators to contemplate. The most devastating puncher in the world, perhaps the most powerful fighter in the history of the sport, was also as graceful as a tap dancer. It was a fine show, and after it was over, its star mixed with the audience, answering a few softball questions, and posed for pictures. But from the opening day of the Sonny Liston Review, Clay threatened to crash the gate. Wearing jackets with bear hunting on the back and carrying walking sticks, members of Cassius's camp watched Sonny train, creating an uneasy feeling in the champion's quarters. Cassius also spoke often about invading Liston's plush digs. Liston wasn't amused. "This guy is some kind of nut," he said. "They had better stop him, or I will. Enough is enough." But enough was never enough for Cassius. On February 7th, he made his move. Dressed in a tuxedo and carrying his hand-carved cane, he led a march to the Surfside headquarters. Denied entrance, he hollered and protested, sure that some constitutional principle was at stake. "I'm ready to go to jail if I'm breaking the law," he asserted. "This is a public place, and I have the right to be here." For the generation of sports writers who had matured during the era of the two Joes, DiMaggio and Lewis, Clay's performance indicated the passing of an age when dignity framed the game. None was more outraged than Jimmy Cannon, the dean of the reverential school of sports journalism. "In the year of the Beatles, it is right that Cassius Clay fights Sonny Liston for the heavyweight championship of the world," he wrote from Miami. "It is the time of the freak on earth. You see it all and watch it happen, but you can't believe it. It belongs in the territory of dreams. The next war must be between the sane and the insane." To Cannon, Clay and the Beatles were the essence of modernity, of artists splattering canvases with gobs and streaks, of actors who seemed to be reading their lines off pieces of confetti thrown up on a windy day, of musicians who repudiate melody, of the bored children of the atomic age. Liston was as traditional as Cannon, lumping Clay and the Beatles in the same trash heap of modern culture. On Sunday, February 9th, the Beatles changed the landscape of popular music with their appearance in New York on The Ed Sullivan Show. As adolescent girls screamed hysterically and an estimated 73 million television viewers looked on in amazement, they sang 5 songs, ending with their #1 hit single, I Want to Hold Your Hand. The next Sunday, they made their second appearance on the show, this one televised from the Deauville Hotel in Miami Beach. Liston attended the performance with Joe Lewis and publicist Harold Conrad. When Sullivan introduced him, he stood and acknowledged the smattering of cheers, but he was unimpressed with the Beatles. When they began to sing, he nudged Conrad with his elbow and asked, "Are these motherfuckers what all the people are screaming about? My dog plays drums better than that kid with the big nose." After the show, Conrad arranged for the Beatles to come to the 5th Street Gym for a photo op with Cassius. It was a pitch-perfect idea, the marriage of sports and music, signaling that at the highest level, it was all about entertainment and money. The Beatles were compliant, though none had any interest in boxing. George Harrison remembered, "It was all a part of being a Beatle, really. Just getting lugged around and thrust into rooms full of pressmen, taking pictures and asking questions." They had performed in some dingy, cigar-smelling clubs in Hamburg and Liverpool, so the grimy walls and dank smells of the 5th Street Gym were nothing new. But being stiffed by Clay was. "Where the fuck's Clay?" Ringo asked as they arrived. When John Lennon learned that Cassius was not in the gym, he said to the others, "Let's get the fuck out of here." But 2 security guards blocked their exit and pushed them into an empty dressing room. 15 minutes later, Cassius burst through the door, his personality filling the dressing room. "He was beautiful," Lipsight reported. "He seemed to glow. He was laughing. 'Hello there, Beatles,' he shouted. 'We ought to do some road shows together. We'll get rich.'" The mood of the Beatles brightened immediately. Though the musicians knew almost nothing about Clay, and he had never even heard of them, they seemed to siphon energy from each other. They performed a campy act for the cameramen, Cassius knocking down all 4 with a single punch, standing over them in a victory pose, grabbing Ringo and lifting him above his head. They were all, Beatles and boxer alike, consummate showmen. They knew their roles, hit all their cues, wrote Bob Spitz. Clay mesmerized them, recalled photographer Harry Benson. They were captivated by Clay's looks, fresh, innocent, oddly an Americanized image of themselves. But more than that, they sensed his physical and emotional power. They were products of their manager, Brian Epstein, packaged and presented according to his uncanny commercial instincts. But Cassius was his own man. He controlled who he was. He had manufactured himself. He lived on his own terms. But living on his own terms came with greater risks than the Beatles realized. On February 20th, after spending nearly a month in New York, Malcolm X returned to Miami. That night, in the lobby of the Hampton House, he sat on a sofa answering questions from a Herald reporter, a clear violation of his suspension. He could not resist a platform, and he loved the attention. Malcolm may have said that he wanted to return to the nation, but as important as Elijah had been to his development, he had grown beyond the messenger's limited goals. He had his own ideas, his own plans, and he wanted the world to know it. What he wanted most was freedom. Freedom to speak his mind, freedom to engage politicians and foreign dignitaries, and the freedom to think for himself. At this stage, he was unsure of how to achieve his ambitions. He desperately wanted to remain in the nation, but he wanted it on his own terms. The following day, the FBI mailed an anonymous tip to various media outlets suggesting a widening rift between Malcolm and Elijah. Based on wiretap intelligence, specialists working the COINTELPRO fabricated a story, hoping to widen the gulf between Muhammad and Malcolm. The story suggested that the minister felt that Elijah Muhammad is in his declining years and that he is slipping. Given the chance, the source claimed, Malcolm would not hesitate one moment to take over the leadership of the Nation of Islam. Convinced that the tip came from a legitimate source, journalists began reporting that Malcolm had started a war for power against Muhammad. The news traveled fast. That same afternoon, Muhammad's personal secretary called Malcolm with a message. His request for reinstatement before the upcoming Savior's Day convention had been denied. She told him that Elijah refused to lift the ban because he continued to rebel. Malcolm requested a hearing to defend himself against the charges, but again, his appeal was rejected. Later that night, Muhammad delivered another message. This time, though, he made the call himself. He warned Cassius X that all good Muslims should stay away from Malcolm during his suspension. 4 days before his title match, Cassius began contemplating the repercussions of hosting Malcolm. Muhammad reminded him that Malcolm had violated his edict and that all disobedient Muslims would suffer punishment. After speaking with Elijah, Cassius realized that he had endangered his relationship with the Supreme Minister. The failure to heed his warning, he understood, would have consequences. Bill MacDonald did not like having Malcolm in Clay's camp any more than Elijah Muhammad did. The same day that Clay spoke to Elijah, MacDonald called Clay into his office, threatening to cancel the fight if he didn't denounce the black Muslims. MacDonald complained that his involvement with Malcolm had provoked a boycott by the Jewish community, which was large and powerful in Miami. The Muslims' past comments about Jews exploiting blacks were hurting the gate, he insisted. Others criticized Clay's relationship with the Nation of Islam as well. Marion Jackson, a black writer for the Atlanta Daily World, condemned Cassius for opposing integration and promoting the views of the nation. Clay, through his association with Malcolm X, Muhammad, and other black Muslims, has revealed himself as a white-hating racist at the time when intergroup progress is being made throughout the South. Yet MacDonald failed to convince Clay to rebuke the Muslims. He could not understand why Cassius would allow him to cancel the match, risking his only chance at the title. "My religion is more important to me than the fight," Clay said. Despite his sincerity, MacDonald replied that he had no choice. He was canceling the fight. Publicist Harold Conrad was stunned by the decision. He told MacDonald that it was too late. They had already sold thousands of tickets and signed contracts with closed-circuit theaters. "The hell I can't call it off," MacDonald retorted. "You're a Northerner. You don't understand. You don't realize that Miami is the Deep South and is just as segregated as any town in Mississippi. How can I promote a fight down here with a guy who thinks we're white devils?" Conrad pleaded with him to change his mind. "Bill, you're going to go down in history as the guy who denied a fighter a title shot because of his religion," he said. "Bullshit! Don't start hitting me with the Constitution." MacDonald was unsure of his next move. "It's that Malcolm X. He's responsible for all this trouble, and he's practically running the kids' fight camp. That don't look good." Conrad had an idea. If he could convince Malcolm to leave town, would MacDonald allow the fight to go on? "Yeah, I guess so," the promoter answered. Conrad drove out to Clay's house, where he met the fighter, surrounded by somber Muslims. When he walked into the house, the hostility was palpable. Cassius was in no mood to talk with him either. Conrad turned toward Malcolm and explained that the fight was off, but you can save it for him. "How?" Malcolm asked. "You have to get out of town now. You're the focal point. You're the guy the press knows." Malcolm looked away from Conrad. He just stood there, calculating. He thought about Cassius. Finally, he answered, "All right, I'll go, but I'm coming back for the fight." Conrad offered his hand in a forced smile, but Malcolm wouldn't shake it. He simply touched the white man's wrist with his forefinger and walked away. The fight was back on.
That will wrap us up for this week. We're at the end of Chapter 10, so next week we'll start at the very beginning of Chapter 11, Context of White Supremacy. The number to dial is 641-715-3640. The code is 564-943#. Press *6 if you would like to participate. All the folks who dialed in with a hand up, should be with us. If there are any folks that have not been able to share at all, you should be sure to dial in right now. Get your hand up first so we can hear from you. Other than that, everyone who dialed in with a hand up, line is open. Feel free to chime in.
I have a quick question. What do you think about that last gesture? I mean, where Minister Malcolm just refused to shake this man's hand, and he just like touched his wrist, and like, what do you think about that? I mean, if you're in a public place or you're conducting business, how do you feel about that? I mean, you know, people are always saying we're always supposed to be polite, but sometimes it just becomes a little bit much.
I thought it was great. Minister Malcolm was not here like conducting business for himself personally or even for Muhammad Ali. They're just coming in like, you know, hey, nigger, get out of town. You're messing things up. And, you know, for him to try to figure out what would be the best way to proceed to not mess things up for his friend, Cassius Clay at the time, and still recognizing that, you know, they're just practicing racism. I mean, how am I supposed to, why should I even entertain this as though this is something other than a racist? So I thought it was great to not even acknowledge and even give the veneer like we're going to be civil. I'm not even going to shake your hand. I thought it was great.
Okay, thank you.
I have an opinion. I was about to say I have an opinion about the question also. A lot of times, what I found out about handshaking with white people, it's not necessarily from a means of courtesy. They would stick their hand out, even to the point to where if they're trying to fire you from your job. It's kind of like a gesture of, is this nigga submitting to my power? And it's almost like in my mind shaming the victim because I'm sticking my hand out. And now, mind you, now, boy, gal, you're supposed to be courteous. You're supposed to be courteous. And what I've actually saw that in one of the many renditions of Muhammad Ali's autobiography on movies and whatnot. I've actually seen that actual rendition that was done on a movie where this white guy, the same white guy y'all talking about, stuck his hand out, you know, and that's exactly what the actor did in the movie. That sort of thing. But yeah, that's my plug on that as far as that concerned. He did the right thing because it was phony in the first place, and Malcolm X wasn't obligated in any form or fashion. He understood that it was a practice of racist white supremacy going on, and he did not want to harm the efforts of his friend Muhammad Ali.
Can I be heard?
You're a little low. If you could speak up, sir.
Okay, is that better?
Yes, sir.
Okay, what the point I wanted to bring up was the journalists, the newspaper reporters, the authors, people who wrote articles, especially that Houston Hood, or whatever his name was, all with a racist agenda, and even the black journalists may have been used unknowingly, you know, in trying to, you know, create this atmosphere against the NOI and whether or not Cassius Clay was a member of it. You know, it was all created. And then you see this perpetuation of, you know, what's coming out of it. So I believe that Malcolm did the right thing when he just decided to leave, to let the fight go on. I'll mute my line.
May I be heard?
Yes, sir.
I too just want to kind of expand on the reporters. For me, it kind of seems their interest in Ali's conversion to Islam. It kind of reminds me of when white people on the job notice when black people kind of become more codified. They get very interested only just to slam you in the end. And I also, and I may be wrong when I say this, but I've seen the Made in Miami documentary on Ali, and I could have sworn they said that the Beatles really didn't want to do the photo shoot initially because they felt that Ali kind of talked too much. But I may be wrong when I say that. And I wanted to ask, who was the gentleman who said that Ali was a white-hating racist? I just kind of wanted to point that out, that was an oxymoron. And I'll mute my line.
I think that might have been McDonald, but I'll double check whether that was one of the journalists or if that was the actual guy who put on the fight. I'll double check. Other folks have commentary? Oh, it was Marion Jackson. This is actually a black victim of racism, black writer for the Atlanta Daily World, condemned Cassius for opposing integration and promoting the views of the nation. Clay, through his association with Malcolm X, Muhammad, and other black Muslims, has revealed himself as a white-hating racist at a time when intergroup progress is being made through the South. And all of that is in quotes from the black journalist Marion Jackson, victim of racism. But I think someone already touched that some black people were used to support the white supremacist agenda, which is pretty standard operating procedure.
Gus, can I?
Let's
Sorry.
nab some of the other folks that we haven't heard from in the second section. Since the second audio segment conclude, are there folks that we have not heard from?
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
All right. Thank you. I wanted to start on page 159, where the authors wrote, Malcolm's message sounded to Clay like a voice from a burning bush. At a moment when the world seemed to doubt him, the man Cassius greatly admired never lost faith. Malcolm filled him with confidence. And if he said that Allah ordained the victory, then it must be true. Malcolm, Cassius believed, only spoke the truth, but he told him a lie, the same lie that he told reporters and himself, that he would be reinstated within 90 days. Malcolm was living in the past. At some level, he must have realized that he would never return to the nation, but he held out hope that he would reconcile with Elijah. He desperately wanted to believe it, and he convinced Cassius. Throughout January and early February, he wrote the messenger pleading for reinstatement, but he received only silence from Chicago. Most likely, Malcolm's enemies intercepted the letters before they ever reached Elijah. The silence troubled him, making him even more desperate to do something to restore his place in the nation. I found those two paragraphs to be an extremely potent act of racism, white supremacy, because Malcolm didn't lie. I remember hearing Dr. Clark talk about this extensively, and it took him many, many years before he opened up to say anything about his relationship with Malcolm X, because he always talked about the fact that when Minister Malcolm passed away, that all of these people, both black and white, who really hated him, came out of the woodworks to talk about how much they loved him, and he didn't want to join that bandwagon of phony people, running around talking about their relationship, because he actually had one. They were very close, and he respected the relationship that much. But then when he discussed it, he talked about the fact that when him and Malcolm discussed that issue, he sincerely believed that he would have been able to reconcile with Elijah, and that's what he really wanted to do. He made it emphatically clear that the last thing Malcolm wanted to do was break away from the nation at all, and that's something that I think they really put this idea out there as if he knew he wasn't going to be reinstated, and he lied, told this overt lie to disrespect our ancestor, when the reality was he did not want that rift with Elijah, because he did see him as a father figure, probably more so than his own father, because he lost his father so young, at such a young age. So just the fact that they put that out there in that way, is just a highly refined act of racism, white supremacy, especially for those who may be reading this book and not know the history between Malcolm and Elijah and how much he really loved and respected this man and how much he was hurt by that rift. And also the fact that he didn't like any sort of animosity between other black people. It started to really transition, even with his own anti-blackness. I think his consciousness really was just growing exponentially in the way in which he understood that this intra-black conflict was just not the way to go. Then I find on page 164, they wrote, the writers peppered him with questions. Are you actually a member of the Nation of Islam? One asked. And he says, Cassius says, I was born a Muslim, I was told. My race descended from the people in Egypt and Africa whose religion had always made them Muslim. For the first time, writers heard him connect the struggles of black Americans and colonized Africans. It upset him that the Africans are treated better in this country than the American Negro. The Negro was not treated like an American, he said, echoing Malcolm. And I find this telling that white people always seem to equate Egypt with Africa when it suits their purposes. In the vast majority of cases, they'll call Egypt the Middle East or say it's a part of the Middle East. When they put it in the context of white supremacy now and the fact that Muhammad Ali himself actually put Africa and Egypt together as him being a descendant of these people, then they equate it with being colonized black Africa and black Americans. So I just find that to be another act of white supremacy too, the way that they play the semantics game as far as our history, as far as Egypt being in the Middle East or whether it's on the continent. And the only reason they made that connection, I believe, I could be wrong, is because Cassius Clay himself made that connection. So I found that to be very telling and stand out. There's another brief section on the bottom of page 166 and to the top of 167. It says, Winston said that it didn't bother him, but it did. He traveled a long way from a sharecropper shack in Arkansas and whippings of a cruel father. He had survived the streets, prison, and the police of Missouri and Pennsylvania. Unable to read or write, he preferred violence as his medium of expression. But as journalist Jerry Eisenberg noted, Sonny was illiterate, but he wasn't ignorant or stupid or unfeeling. There was a sort of dignity to his sullen, brutal life. He accepted who he was and the fact that people regarded him as a thug. And as the heavyweight champion of the world, he did not ask for love or popularity. Still, he thought he deserved some semblance of respect. That, of course, was precisely what Cassius Clay denied him. Socially and culturally, Cassius transformed the title fight into a contest about many things: beauty, age, law and order, and race, but dignity was not on the list. I found that they were practicing racism here because they equated him with the brute by saying that because he was unable to read or write, that he preferred violence as his medium of expression. That is one of the most racist things you could ever say. But then sentences later, they say he was illiterate, but he wasn't ignorant, stupid, or unfeeling. So what is he, either a savage, brute nigger, or is he someone who has feelings or a human being? So I think they're playing really sick semantical games there. And I just found that to be just a blatant act of white supremacy, the way that they describe him. And it's almost like they lie and then they tell the truth a few sentences later, which is what I find white people tend to do all the time. And I think that's it. Yes, that's it. Thank you very much for taking my call.
Folks, we have not heard from it all during the second audio segment. After the conclusion of the second audio segment, folks, we have not heard from it all.
Do you think that maybe the FBI could be making some of these things up? Kind of writing the story the way they wanted it written? Some of the, I guess, what they say that they took as app phone calls or secret conversations and those other things. Do you think there's a possibility they could have been making some of this stuff up?
According to their own record, they have admitted making things up about black people and having it published in newspapers or whatever the case. So it's certainly, they have admitted as much. So it certainly could be possible that they, put things in these files and then release them, and that's not actually what was said or whatever the case. I mean, there's no way you could corroborate or validate whether or not the information is accurate or true, what have you. But I mean, they have admitted as much.
Yeah, because I mean, it's a little too detailed. It's either the authors are adding their own pieces to the story, or maybe the FBI made the story a little bit more juicier than they wanted to fit their own agenda, I think. But either or, I think this is two tragic figures who it's always that what if factor with them. What if Malcolm never was assassinated, and what if Muhammad Ali never got Parkinson's? And I'll mute my line. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Folks we have not heard from after the conclusion of the second audio segment.
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
All right. Not to deviate from the book Blood Brothers or take away anything from the conversation. I want to read an excerpt from The Soul of a Butterfly, which is a book that's written by Muhammad Ali.
With a white ghostwriter.
With a white ghostwriter, okay. So that adds to that. But I thought majority of what they were saying right here in this part concerning the section of the book we in with Blood Brothers, where it says that Elijah Muhammad had a mission to unite black people in the spirit of racial pride, and he accomplished much. After Elijah Muhammad's death, his son Wallace D. Muhammad took over the nation and brought me, along with many of his father's followers, to mainstream Sunni Islam. Malcolm was the first to discover the truth that color doesn't make a man a devil. It is the heart and soul and mind that define a person. And it continues on. Malcolm X was a great thinker and even greater friend. I might never have been a Muslim if it hadn't been for Malcolm. If I could go back and do it over again, I would never have turned my back on him. And so, not taking away from anything that has been said so far, I think that, that point of view, like how this is written, even if it does have a white racist, white supremacist ghostwriter accomplished with it, I looked at this version as showing Muhammad Ali like having a different point of view towards Malcolm and that whole thing that happened as far as the rift between him and Malcolm X. And so just for information purposes, I found that to be significant. That's all.
Appreciate that. Thomas Howard was the ghostwriter I was thinking of, but that is not the same book. Thomas Howard was the ghostwriter for Muhammad Ali, His Life and Times, which some of our other folks are reading simultaneously with this. His daughter co-wrote The Soul of a Butterfly. So not the same person, just making sure I'm correcting myself. Error there. Mr. Hauser was the ghostwriter on a different biography. There are lots of them on Muhammad Ali. Other folks we have not heard from during the second audio segment. Other folks we have not heard from. We get everybody? I'll assume we got everybody. I'll make sure to get back retired firefighter before we wrap things up. One thing I did want to point out before I started studying racism, white supremacy seriously, I was studying racism at the time, but I was studying from the angle of COINTELPRO. There's a lot of information about what that project entailed, how it has evolved, continuing right now, 2016. The name William Sullivan, that is one that I'm very familiar with when it pops up later on in Chapter 10 where it says, when William C. Sullivan, the assistant director at the FBI, learned about Clay's presence at the Muslims dinner, he concluded that the boxer had joined the Nation of Islam a few weeks earlier. Sullivan had circulated a memo among leading FBI officials encouraging a counterintelligence program to discredit Malcolm, Elijah Muhammad, Martin Luther King, and other prominent black figures. Special agents working in the Bureau's covert program had infiltrated organizations like the Nation of Islam, disrupted their activities through wiretap surveillance, forged documents and blackmail, and planted false media stories, to Thomas's earlier point. Armed with information about Clay's affiliations, Sullivan tipped off the press and added his name, Clay at the time, to a list of NOI targets. Massively important paragraph that should not be glossed over in reading this. Again, this just ended up being much like right now, any of these attacks on Black Lives Matter just end up being attack on black people, period. Same type of thing, whether you're in the Nation of Islam or NAACP or SNCC or any other organization. If you are a black person, your loyalties are suspect, and that happened to lots and lots of black people, 60s, 70s, right on up to today. One of the more important things that I keep in mind with William Sullivan, again, he was the number 3. He was the third most powerful person at the FBI during his tenure in the 1960s, in the thick of all of their COINTELPRO activities that resulted in the deaths of a lot of black people, including Minister Malcolm X, Dr. Martin Luther King, Fred Hampton, lots of other Black Panther Party members as well. But when they finally, this became kind of public knowledge, how extensive this program was and how many people it was targeting. When this started to come out in the 70s, when they had the House Select Committee on Assassinations and started investigating, at least at a superficial level, some of the activities of the FBI, William Sullivan was scheduled to testify about the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King and if there was any FBI involvement. Strangely, he is shot and killed in a hunting accident, literally days, like it might have even been the day before, but I mean, it was within a day or two before he was supposed to testify. He is shot and killed in a hunting accident. And it's just thought, oh my gosh, some freak accident. Can't believe this happened. Oh, well, won't get his testimony now. Extremely important. He was extremely knowledgeable about all of the activities that they had been conducting, and he was about to perhaps spill the beans and had to be neutralized. Very important. You can check that out on your own if you want to do more research, but I thought that was hugely important. In fact, this whole section here kind of made the point. I think that was one of the main themes that I said after the conclusion of the first audio segment. I've been saying it the whole time that we were reading, that the main point that should be emphasized, it should maybe even be in the title, is the FBI's destruction of Minister Malcolm X, Muhammad Ali, their friendship, and their broader war against black people during this time, because that seems to be the dominant theme, particularly as we're moving along and Muhammad Ali is becoming more political, more outspoken about his views. You're just seeing, unless I am misreading, just increased activity by enforcement agents, white supremacy enforcement officials, targeting, surveilling all of these individuals, not just the main two figures in this book. Even when some of the other things that I noted this chapter, I'll try and get to them as quickly as possible, where it talks about Minister Malcolm, and I agree with what Roz said. I think I've heard many other folks, not just Dr. John Henrik Clark, but Ozzie Davis, who was a good friend of Malcolm X as well, shout the late Ozzie Davis, the late Ruby D, that they said the same thing, that if Minister Malcolm wanted to reconcile things, and if that had presented itself as an opportunity, he would have taken it immediately. I think that they are all telling the truth. But where it talks about Minister Malcolm writing these letters to Chicago and trying to explain and see if he can work things out with Elijah Muhammad, and he talks about these letters being intercepted, I suspect that could have been FBI agents, CIA agents, local Chicago enforcement officials who also worked in conjunction with the FBI and their COINTELPRO program. That's how Fred Hampton, Mark Clark were assassinated in 1969. Moving forward, let's see. I thought that this whole, where they posit that Minister Malcolm had this Machiavellian plan to get himself in these photographs with Cassius Clay, and that would manipulate Elijah Muhammad into having to accept him back in, or to discipline Cassius Clay for being in association with Malcolm when he was under punishment. and that would help reveal the true nature of Elijah Muhammad to Cassius Clay. None of that is in quotes. None of that is in footnotes. So I'm to take it that is all the deduction that the white authors have come to. In my view, that's an act of racism, white supremacy, to just make this assessment, and it's not even presented as this is our view, this is what I think, this is our speculation about what happened. It's just presented as this is fact. And again, there are no footnotes to support any of this. There are no documents to support that, we found this. He wrote this in his journal that this was his plan. I just think that that's, a major act of racism, in my view, on the co-authors of the text. Let's see. I thought from Freddie Pacheco, where he says, you listen to Cassius Clay, this man known all over the world for his mouth, can't even converse. You don't get an exchange of ideas. He doesn't even hear you. That sounds like the way I would expect a racist to talk about a black person, to disparage your mental abilities or your ability to communicate, that, you can't even listen. He can't even speak. It's just ridiculous. This, loudmouth Negro here. Let's see. Where the FBI, where they're wiretapping when he has the conversation, Minister Malcolm, when he finds out that his wife, Betty Shabazz, that she's going to come to Miami, bring the children. The FBI are listening immediately. Dispatch a vehicle. We're going to follow Cassius Clay. Just again, that should be at the forefront in the analysis of all of this, leading up to his biggest fight of his career at that time. And you're being tailed just for being in communication with Minister Malcolm. He doesn't control nuclear weapons. He doesn't have a budget. He's broke. He doesn't even have a house that he can say is legally his at the time. But all of this attention, and I think we already heard Sonny Liston, he couldn't get in the vehicle without if police and officials coming to make trouble for him. Same thing happened with Cassius Clay, just the type of thing that you should keep in mind as you see a lot of these problems that black people have, particularly with enforcement officials ending up being in a vehicle that you are being pursued. If you are a black person, it doesn't matter if you have any political ties or whatever the case may be. This is what it means when we say that racism, white supremacy is war. It's terrorism, deliberately targeting black people. The section, let's see, where Cassius Clay, he goes to give this dinner in New York with members of the NOI, and he talks about, he's proud to associate with Minister Malcolm, and he's being punished at the time, so the crowd is not, receptive to that. Where it says the crowd was stunned. No one in the mosque talked publicly about Malcolm, let alone called him a brother. An informant told the FBI that the Muslims were very cold toward Cassius for defending Minister Malcolm, especially after the messenger had said to put him down. Just again, like that, this should be at the forefront of the book, like how widespread the targeting of these individuals was and the role that played in everything that happened, how they responded, what they did, what they didn't do, conflicts that erupted, how this should be at the forefront of how we think really about this entire period of time, in my opinion, and all of these folks, since this is massive and government sanctioned and led to killings, deaths, murders, imprisonment. Let's see. Last thing I'll get in. Let's see. The FBI segment just continues all the way throughout the book. That stood out to me just hugely in this section where it says the following day the FBI mailed an anonymous tip to various media outlets suggesting a widening rift between Malcolm and Elijah. I think one of the things that John Potash, when he was on the FBI's war against Tupac Shakur and black leaders, and he also did the second book, Drugs as a Weapon Against Us, one of the things that he points out consistently in both books is the placement in mainstream media outlets, the New York Times and these type of publications, that these folks are either subcontracted by CIA officials, FBI officials, to make these official reports about drugs or black people or whatever they're going to talk about. And sometimes they're just taking direct reports and letters that have been authored by FBI officials for whatever racist purposes, whatever their racist agenda happens to be. You just get more evidence of that here, something that should be kept in mind 2016, because I am sure that continues. But again, and that ends up having just such a huge impact because people read, if you're less informed about racism, you're not suspicious about whites, you don't understand that this is the major activity that is being conducted worldwide at all times, all areas of people activity. You read this information and you don't think, oh, well, this is just more racist lies. This is just more white supremacy propaganda to influence how we think, speak, act, even our emotions, particularly how we think about black people. Retired firefighter, were you going to comment, sir?
Yes, I concur with. I think you were talking about. I've seen what I think all of the pictures that existed with Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali. And I can almost mention every last one of them, but I won't. But if not, so as far as all of these pictures, as the reading was stating, I don't see it as being true from the standpoint of both individuals are no longer alive, and so there's no reason that it wouldn't be shown for any reason. So I agree with you. It's kind of like it's got to be some practicing of racist white supremacy. But also, I just wanted to mention also that now from my studies, the publicity stunt to send the Beatles to first was to send them to Sonny Liston, and as the last reading reported, Sonny Liston was not impressed by them at all, and he did not want to be in no photo shoot with the Beatles because they didn't like them anyway. So therefore, they sent them to the number one contender at that time, which was Cassius Clay, and that's how that meeting came up. And one thing about Muhammad Ali, known in the past as Cassius Clay, what is kind of like common now, he was a trendsetter on as far as bringing up publicity for himself. He was like a trendsetter. Even Sugar Ray Robinson, who was very flamboyant, was not that much of a talker in that way. He was a somewhat of a real shrewd businessman from the standpoint. Right at the day of the fight, Sugar Ray Robinson would say, "Hey, if this is not done right, I'm not going to fight." But not the way in Muhammad Ali would talk up the fight and make people either love him or hate him, one of the two. And it's kind of like, common now with some certain personalities in all sports. And keep in mind, during that time, the NBA was not as popular as it is now. The NFL was not as popular then as it was now. The heavyweight champion of the world was probably, if not the highest, one of the highest sports titles you can achieve at the time. So he was like a trendsetter. Last but not least, I just wanted to give a brief history on what is called Brownsville. It also was nicknamed Brown Sub, and the Hampton House. Brownsville, with the entry of, by that time, Overtown was like filled to the capacity. They already was putting I-95 through the middle of that area, and in turn, the spillover from black people that was getting a little bit more economically sound based on the GI Bill that took place from World War II. That's what black males did with their money. They went about the means of getting for themselves and their families the first house in that family's generation. So they either cut down south, which is where my origins was, in a place called Richmond Heights. You had a guest on talking about just somewhat. Some people didn't want to go down way out in the woods, as they called it back during that time. So what they would do, because Brownsville is not that far north of Overtown, and from there, they've already been statistics that white people, when it's about 12% of black people that comes into the area where they at, they leave, and it don't take a long time for them to leave and go somewhere else, and that's what took place. So therefore, those homes it was allowed for non-white black people to go at the time. part of that history was also on Eyes on the Prize from the section that was talking about the 1980 rebellion, where they interviewed a black male who moved into his house in Brownsville, and nice white ladies went about the means of picketing, get this nigger out of out of our area. And in turn, he turned on his water sprinklers, and instead of the police, somebody called the police. Instead of them dealing with the white ladies, they arrested him. But nevertheless, that was just a improvement in Cassius Clay's salary, and he was able to move into a house. The house is still there. I've been by there myself. Even well after he moved out of the house and moved into Chicago and some other places where he stayed at, he would go back and visit the people in the area. That's just his personality. Hampton House, as they did tell the truth about Hampton House, as far as it was a improvement, because by that time the hotels and living facilities in Overtown was becoming dilapidated, and in turn the Hampton House was still kind of like, you know, a well-known place for black celebrities. You name the person in the 1950s and the 60s, they stayed at the Hampton House, including the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Matter of fact, the quote-unquote famous speech that he did in 1963 in the March on Washington, he actually said that speech at the Hampton House probably about a few weeks before, something like that. He just tweaked it from the one that we all know about in Washington, D.C. It went dilapidated for about maybe 25 years, and right now, presently, they made it out of they saved portions of it and made it out of a museum now. I don't even know if they finished with the product. I haven't been by there yet, but it's in like a museum form now. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
For sure. We will wrap there. I have the ebook version, and I changed the size of the window from what it was, so it changed up the page number, so I have to recalibrate. But either way, we are kind of on the home stretch. I think the max we'll have is 3 more of these sessions. It might only be 2, but max 3, so we are getting close. I'll announce whatever book we're going to do next week, but we'll pick up next week. We're on chapter 11 from Blood Brothers. If you have comments, feel free, write them in. We'll read them on the air. Someone did include a comment for me to read. I just forgot to include it this week. I'll read it next week, but drop us an email, untiljustice@gmail.com, and we'll be sure to read your thoughts, analysis. I will encourage Mr. Demery for his idea. Write a review. You can go to Amazon and write a review and let people know you think the authors are practicing racism. You can cite a passage or two of what you've heard, or you can just give a general synopsis of what you've heard in the book, how it's been presented. I think that would be great counter-racist effort, and it doesn't take, you don't have to write a thesis. You can write, 5-6 sentences, be done with it, moving forward. We'll be here tomorrow, compensatory call-in, 9 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Central, 6 p.m. Pacific tomorrow evening. Looking forward to hearing from folks. We'll catch up on what's gone down the last 7 days, and again, Monday, we'll do our review, Sue Africa's visit this week to the context of white supremacy. Looking forward to analyzing, hearing thoughts. Thanks for folks tuning in. Hope it was a constructive investment of your Friday evening. I will say again, go out, have fun, enjoy the sun, remain codified. Sobriety would be best under conditions of white supremacy. You just heard about the FBI following around Cassius Clay at the time in his vehicle, the problem Sonny Liston had. That for sure continues 2016. You do not want to be under the influence of anything in your vehicle. That's whether you're a driver, passenger, even as a pedestrian. You're making the job of the Darren Wilsons and Daniel Holtzclaws way easy. Let's be in the best possible frame of mind so we can make outstanding decisions to try to keep ourselves as safe as possible, you and anybody that you might be responsible for. Again, one of the worst combinations in the universe, whites, alcohol. Keep that in mind at all times. Take it very seriously. Thanks for everyone tuning in. Creator, we ask that you help us remain patient with other black people. victims of white supremacy, we ask that you help us remain patient with ourselves. Remind us to demonstrate the highest levels of black self-respect at all times, in all places, each and every area of people activity, every time we are in contact with another black person. It has been time. Replace white supremacy with justice immediately. Cal signing out. Thanks all for tuning in.
Nigga, you so brainwashed.
I'm a victim, brother.
Problem. You're a victim.
I'm a victim of 400 years of conditioning.
Shut up.
The man has programmed my conditioning. Even my conditioning has been conditioned.